The kitchen at Guestling was warm that autumn evening, and the fire had burned down to a low red heart. A kettle hissed on the hook above it. On the table sat a plain earthen bowl of gruel, still steaming, the spoon laid neatly beside it. Mary Ann stood by the window with her hands folded, listening to the wind moving in the elms beyond the yard. Her husband was upstairs calling weakly for water. He had been calling like that for 3 days. She did not answer him yet. She only watched the light fail across the fields, and the shadows gather along the sill, and the little white powder that clung, almost invisibly, to the rim of the bowl. Somewhere in the village, a dog was barking. And then, very softly, she carried the gruel upstairs. The quiet house at Guestling. Good evening, and welcome. Welcome back if you have been here before, and welcome for the first time if you have not. This is the Bedside Historian, and the night has grown quiet around us. The world has drawn in close. Whatever room you are in, whatever pillow is under your head, let your shoulders drop a little now. There is nowhere you need to be for a long while. I would like to know where you are listening from tonight. A town, a valley, a room on a high floor, a small kitchen with the light left on. And I would like to know what the hour is on your side of the night. Whether the clock has just crept past 10, or whether it is deep past midnight and the street outside has gone silent. Wherever you are, and whenever it is, you are welcome here. If you would like to help this channel grow, please subscribe and press the little button that shows you liked it. It costs you nothing, and it tells the quiet places of the internet that a story like this one deserves to be told. I am grateful for every listener who does. And I am grateful for you, whether you do or not, because you are here, and that is enough for tonight. Now let us go somewhere else for a while. Let us leave the room you are in and the year you are in, and travel back a long way to a small parish in the south of England in the autumn of 1848. The place is called Guestling. It sits in the county of Sussex, a few miles from the sea at Hastings, tucked into the folds of the Weald, where the fields end in hedges and the hedges end in woods. If you had walked its lanes then, you would have heard sheep on the hillside and the creak of a cart on the flint, and very little else. At the edge of the village, on a rise of ground beyond the church, there stood a cottage of brick and lime plaster, with a thatched roof going grey at the ridge. It was not a poor cottage by the measure of the parish. It had 2 rooms on the ground floor, and 2 above, a scullery built on at the back, a small yard with a pump, a lean-to for the pig, and a strip of garden where cabbages leaned against a low fence. A wooden gate hung on one hinge, and had done for a year. The step was worn in the middle where the mistress of the house had stood 1,000 mornings to shake out the mat. Inside, on the evening we come to first, the kitchen was warm. A fire burned low in the grate, red at the heart and grey at the edges, and a kettle hung from an iron hook above it, humming to itself the way a kettle does when the water is thinking about boiling and has not yet begun. The floor was of stone flags scrubbed to a dull shine. A long table ran down the middle of the room, its surface silvered by years of soap and sand. Against the wall stood a dresser with a row of blue and white plates set up on edge, and below them a shelf of pewter that had been polished until the candlelight moved on it like water. The woman standing by the window was Mary Ann Geering. She was in her 40s then, though the parish would later argue about her exact age, as parishes often do about their women. She was not tall. Her hair, once a heavy chestnut, was going quietly grey at the temples, and she kept it drawn back under a white cap tied at the nape of the neck. Her face was plain and calm, with a small, firm mouth and eyes of a light hazel that noticed everything and gave almost nothing back. She wore a dark woolen gown, a grey linen apron, and a shawl the colour of moss, folded across her shoulders against the draught from the door. She was, by every account the neighbours would later give, a good housewife. Her floors were clean. Her linen was aired. Her bread was even. Her butter kept. She could tell the price of a bushel of wheat at the Hastings market to the nearest penny, and she knew, without looking, how many candles were left in the tin box on the top shelf of the dresser. In a village where many households ran on hope and a slate at the shop, hers ran on arithmetic, and the arithmetic came out right. Her husband was upstairs. His name was Richard Geering, and he was a farm labourer of the older kind, a man who had spent his life in the fields around Guestling and Icklesham and had the weather of it in his hands. He was 2 years past 50. He had married Mary Ann when he was young, and she was younger, and together, over the length of that marriage, they had brought 11 children into the cottage. Some of those children were grown now, and gone into service, or into the army, or into other cottages of their own. Some of them were still small, and moved about the rooms like quiet animals, and would come home tonight from the fields or the lane when the light failed. 3 of the older sons were still in the house. George, the eldest, was in his early 20s and worked alongside his father in the fields. James was a little younger and had begun to be spoken of as a steady young man. Benjamin, the third, was younger still, a boy on the edge of his own working life. All 3 of them slept in the small chamber above the scullery, and all 3 of them, this autumn, were well. Richard was not well. He had come in from the fields 3 days before, complaining of a griping in his stomach and a thirst that no water seemed to answer. The village doctor had been called. His name was Dr. Ticehurst, a stout, tired man in a brown coat who rode a grey mare between 4 parishes and did his best with a bag of pills and a bottle of tincture. He had felt Richard's pulse, looked at his tongue, listened to his complaint, and written the illness down in the little book he carried as English cholera. That was the phrase people used then for any bad stomach that lasted more than a day. It was not the great cholera that had frightened the cities a few years before. It was, they said, the ordinary sort, brought on by a bad chill or a bad meal or the change of the season. You have to remember, if you can, what a country doctor in 1848 had to work with. He had no test that could look inside a man's blood. He had no way to know what was in a bowl of gruel except to taste it, and he was not going to taste it. He had his eyes and his ears and his hands, a stock of remedies he half believed in, and a wall of familiar diseases in his head. When the symptoms of a poisoning matched the symptoms of a summer sickness, and when the household was quiet and the wife was calm, he saw what he had seen 100 times before. He was not a bad man. He was a busy one, working in a country where sudden deaths were common, and where the harvest, the water, and the weather killed more people every year than any human hand. Dr. Ticehurst had gone away that morning saying Richard should be kept warm, given broth if he could take it, and watered often with weak tea. He had promised to come again in the morning. He had ridden off down the lane with his bag across his knee, and the sound of the grey mare's hooves had died away into the hedges. And after that, the cottage had grown quiet again in the particular way a cottage grows quiet when one of its people is ill upstairs and the rest of the household is trying not to make a noise. We have to go carefully now, because the record for these 3 days is thin. Dr. Ticehurst kept notes, but not many. The neighbours were not in the room. Mary Ann was in the room, and Mary Ann never told anyone the truth. So much of what happened in the kitchen at Guestling on those 3 evenings will have to stand in the shape of an outline, without colour. I would rather admit that to you than pretend to know more than I do. What we do know is this. There was gruel. Gruel was the food of the sick in that part of Sussex, as it was almost everywhere in England then. It was oats and water and a little salt, cooked slowly on the hob, until it was soft enough to be swallowed by a man who could not lift his head. It was cheap. It was gentle. It was what a good wife made for her husband when he could not keep down bread. There would have been a bowl of it kept warm on the hob most of that afternoon. There would have been a spoon. There would have been a small brown jug of water beside the bed upstairs, refilled from the pump in the yard. And we know that at some hour of that evening, as the light was going out of the fields and the shadows were pooling along the sill, Mary Ann took a bowl of gruel from the kitchen and carried it up the narrow wooden stairs to her husband. The record does not say what she was thinking. The record does not say whether her hand shook or whether it was steady. The record does not say a word she spoke to him when she reached the top of the stairs. Those things are lost, and it is honest to say they are lost. What the record does say, in the mouths of witnesses who would come later, is that the illness of Richard Geering did not follow the pattern of ordinary English cholera. It came, it went a little, and then it came back worse, always after he had been fed. His throat burned. His stomach turned. He asked for water in a voice that grew hoarser each day. His hands and feet grew cold. And through those days, in the kitchen below, Mary Ann kept the fire in and the kettle on and the bowls washed, and answered the neighbours who called at the door with a face that told them nothing. The neighbours came, because that is what neighbours in a Sussex village did. They came with a jar of jam, or a fresh loaf, or a few eggs wrapped in a cloth. They stood at the gate and asked how Mr. Geering was. Mary Ann would come out to them, wiping her hands on her apron, and would say that he was very poorly, but that Dr. Ticehurst had been, and that they were doing everything they could. She would thank them for the eggs. She would ask after their own people. She would not invite them in. And they would go away, back down the lane, saying to one another that she was a good woman, and that God send her husband well again soon. I would like you to hold that picture in your mind for a moment, before we go any further. The cottage on the rise, the thatch going grey, the gate on its one hinge, the candlelight moving in the kitchen window as the evening comes on, the kettle on the hook, the clean flags, the woman in the moss-coloured shawl standing at the sill with her hands folded, listening, and upstairs, in a low room under the eaves, a man on a straw bed who has begun, without knowing it, to die of something that is not what the doctor has written down. Nothing in that picture, from the outside, is strange. That is the thing that has to be said clearly. If you had been a neighbour in Guestling that autumn, and you had walked past the cottage in the dusk, you would have seen nothing to trouble you. You would have seen a tidy home in a bad season, and a wife tending to her sick husband, and perhaps you would have said a small prayer for both of them under your breath and walked on. That is how these things almost always begin. Not with a scream in the night. With a lit window, and a kettle, and a bowl of oats, and no one at the gate to ask what is in the bowl. 9 years earlier, up a set of narrow wooden stairs above the sign of the Bell in Hastings, Richard Geering's name had been written into a book. It was a small book with a soft leather cover, kept by the secretary of a friendly society, and each week a penny or two from a labourer's wage was set down beside a name, so that when the day came, and every man knew the day would come, there would be enough in the fund to bury him decently, in a coffin of proper wood, with a cloth over the box, and a stone, if the widow could rise to it. Richard did not know, when he set his mark in that book, that the little weekly pennies would one day change the arithmetic of his own kitchen. He only knew that a man of his trade did not want to be buried on the parish. We will come back to that book, and to the small quiet room above the Bell where the secretary kept it. We will come back to the chemist's shop in the High Street at Hastings, and to a paper twist of white powder that was carried home in an apron pocket on a market morning. We will come back to the sons who slept in the room above the scullery, and to the neighbours who began, very slowly, to count the coffins leaving the Geering door. But first we have to understand the woman at the window. And to understand her we have to go further back than the illness, and further back than the cottage, into the lanes of the Sussex Weald where she was young, and where the marriage that ended in that upstairs room was, once, a marriage like any other, a marriage made in the Weald. We have to leave the cottage at Guestling for a while now, and go back a long way. Back before the sickness upstairs, back before the 11 berths and the 11 small shirts hung on the line, back before the ring was ever put on her finger. We have to find the girl before we can understand the wife. And to find the girl, we have to walk west, into the deeper folds of the Weald, where the ground drops between hills covered in oak and ash and hazel, and where the villages sit at the ends of lanes that fill in every winter with clay and rainwater and the leaves of the year before. Sussex, in the last years of the 1700s and the first years of the 1800s, was a slow country. The great roads did not run through it. The turnpike from London went around it, on its way to Brighton in the west or to Dover in the east. A traveller who bothered to cross it did so through a green tunnel of hedges, the coach horses labouring on the clay in wet weather, the wheels striking sparks on the flint in dry. Whole villages of 30 or 40 households sat in clearings that had been made by the axe hundreds of years before, and inside those clearings the same families had been born and married and buried on the same acre of churchyard for so long that the parish clerk knew every stone in the grass without needing to read it. Mary Ann came into that country somewhere near the turn of the century. The parish registers of the Weald are not always kind to those who go looking for a woman's exact year of birth. Her name is written into a book that was kept in a cold vestry, in a hand that has faded, by a curate who was often thinking about other things. The record does not agree on the year. Some hands give it as 1798. Some give it as 1800. Some give it as a year in between. What the record does agree on is that she was of a labouring family and that her name at birth was not Geering. She was born a Plum, a Weald surname common enough in those parishes then, though it is rarer now. Her father worked on the land. Her mother, we may reasonably suppose, did what most labourers' wives did. She washed for wages when there was washing to take in, and she took in a little needlework by candlelight through the long winter evenings, and she buried children between the ones she raised. I will admit something to you here, because it matters. The girlhood of Mary Ann Plum is not really a matter of record. The parish books give a birth. They give, in due course, a marriage. In between there are 20 or so silent years, in which no one wrote anything down about her. That silence is not unusual. It is the silence that swallowed almost every labouring girl in England then. The letters of gentlewomen have come down to us in bundles. The diaries of clerks and clergymen have come down to us in shelves. The daily hours of a Sussex girl in a two-room cottage did not come down to us at all, unless she later did something that made a court reach back for her. So I have to walk you carefully through what a girlhood like hers most probably looked like, without pretending I have a page of her own to read from. That is honest. It is also, in its way, the truest thing I can tell you about her, that for the first half of her life, she was one of tens of thousands of children in country cottages whom nobody thought worth recording. She only became visible when she became terrible. The cottage she grew up in would have been much smaller than the one at Guestling. One room below, one above, an earth floor scraped hard and swept daily with a besom of hazel twigs. A fire kept in a hearth of local ironstone, banked at night with ash so that a coal would still be alive at dawn. A table, a stool or two, a bed for the parents in one corner, and a straw pallet for the children in the other, shared under the same blanket regardless of age or sex, until the eldest went into service. Windows of 2 small panes, set high in the wall, that gave more draught than light. A door of plank oak with a wooden latch, so worn that a child could lift it on tiptoe. Food was what the year allowed. Bread was the centre of every meal, baked once a week in a shared oven in the village. Bacon hung in the chimney and was cut down in slivers no thicker than a shilling. In spring there were nettles and dandelions boiled for greens. In summer there were peas from the strip garden and a little cheese if the goat was well. In autumn there were apples set out on straw in the loft, and a pig killed at Martinmas if the family had raised one and the parson had blessed it. In winter there was, most nights, a bowl of oats and water on the table, with a knob of dripping if the household had been lucky. A labouring child of the Weald grew up knowing how to make a meal out of very little, and how to make very little last. She would have learned all of that at her mother's elbow. Long before she could read, and we do not know for certain whether Mary Ann ever learned to read fluently, though she could sign her own name in a slow, careful hand when the register was put in front of her, she would have known how to strip a hen for the pot, how to pluck it into a bag so the feathers did not fly, how to scald milk without letting it catch, how to press butter in a wooden mould, how to lay a fire so it caught first time, how to darn the heel of a stocking with a wooden mushroom under it. She would have known the weight of a shilling in the hand, and how many pence it broke into, and what those pence would buy on a market morning at Battle or at Hastings. She would have known the price of things. That last is important, and we will come back to it. A country wife of the Weald in that generation was, whether anyone in the parish called her one or not, the treasurer of her household. The husband earned, the wife spent, and the wife, if she was any good, spent less than the husband earned, and put the difference in a jar behind a loose brick, or in a bag pinned to the underside of the mattress. The pennies that came in through the door in a hard hand went out again through the same door in a soft one. If the arithmetic came out right, the family ate through the winter. If it did not, the family owed the shop, and owed the miller, and owed the landlord, and in the end owed the parish, and the parish had a very long memory. Mary Ann grew up in a country in which a woman's grasp on small sums was not a talent. It was a necessity, and by every later account hers was uncommonly firm. We have to move now, and go with her out of the cottage of her girlhood and into the years in which she began to be a young woman. This is where the record goes almost dark for us, and I will not pretend it does not. Between about the age of 13 and the age of the marriage, she was almost certainly in service somewhere. That was the pattern for a labourer's daughter in the Weald. A girl of that class would be sent, at some point in her early teens, to work in a larger household, a farmer's, a miller's, sometimes a parson's, for board and lodging, and a very small wage paid once a year at Michaelmas. She would sleep in a garret. She would rise before dawn. She would scrub and carry and mind the smaller children of the house, and stand at the back door when the pedlar came, and count out the eggs into the basket for market. Which household took her in, and for how many years, and under what mistress, we do not know. Her name is not in the wage books that survive. It may be in a book that has been lost. It may never have been written at all. What we can say is that the young woman who came out of service on the other side, and who came home again to her parents' parish to be married, was a woman with the habits of that life on her. She stood straight. She kept her hands busy. She did not waste words. She looked at a room and saw what needed doing in it before anyone in the room had spoken. Those are the marks of a girl who has been under the eye of a mistress for years, and they never quite leave a woman who has worn them. You do not need me to tell you what she looked like on the day she was married, because no one made a picture of her that day. There is no painting. There is no sketch. Photography was not yet in the parishes. The only likeness of Mary Ann Geering that has come down to us at all is a rough print made much later, after the trial, when a printer in London wanted a face to hang above a broadside, and printers in that trade, then as later, were not fussy about the resemblance. What we have of her on her wedding day is a name on a page in a Sussex parish book, and the age set beside it, and the mark of her husband next to hers, and the two witnesses signing below. Richard Geering was, by all we can tell, an unremarkable young man of the Weald. He was of the same class as the Plums. His people were farm labourers on the eastern edge of the county, the kind of men who worked by the day in harvest and by the week in winter, and who never in their lives held more than a few pounds in cash at any one time. He was of average height. He had brown hair. He had, in the phrase the parish used for such a man, a steady hand and a mild temper. He had walked out with Mary Ann on Sundays after church for the length of a summer or two, in the lanes between the parishes, in the way that country courtships were always conducted then, watched from the gates by mothers, and from the hedges by younger sisters. He had asked her. She had said yes. They were married in a parish church of the Weald, with the door open onto the churchyard, and the sunlight coming down in a long slant across the flagstones. The service was the plain one from the prayer book. There was no bell rung for money. There was no wedding breakfast at an inn. There was, most likely, a meal at one or the other of the parents' cottages after the ceremony, a piece of cured ham, and a loaf and a jug of small beer, and a slice of cake if the mother had had the eggs to spare. And then the two of them walked home together, in the late afternoon light, to whatever cottage the parish had found for them, and the door closed on a marriage that would last, in one form or another, for the whole of the rest of Richard's life. I want you to sit for a moment with the ordinariness of that, because that is the thing the trial books never quite catch, and the broadsides never printed, and the pamphleteers of the 1750s and the 1850s and every other decade have always failed to see. Mary Ann Geering, at the moment she became a wife, was not different from 10,000 other young women in the south of England in that year. She was a labouring girl who had married a labouring man. She had a pan and a bed and a Bible she may or may not have been able to read, and the good wishes of 2 parishes, and no reason on earth to expect anything but the ordinary, hard, half-hungry life that her mother had lived before her, and that her own daughters would live after her. If there was already, in her somewhere, the woman who would one day stand at a window in Guestling with a bowl of oats in her hands, none of the witnesses at that wedding saw her. And, in fairness, I do not think she saw herself. The years after the wedding were the years in which she disappeared again from the record, in the way a wife of that class always did. She was not in the poll books, because women did not vote. She was not in the wage books, because she did not earn a wage. She was not in the crime books, because she committed no crime. She appears in the parish register only in the entries under her husband's name, the baptisms, one after another, of the children born in the small hours in the cottage bedroom, with the local midwife on a stool at the foot of the bed, and a copper of water heating downstairs. 11 of those baptisms would be written down over the course of about 20 years, in 3 parishes, as the family moved from one cottage to the next in search of steadier work. We will come to those births, and to the burials that soon began to sit beside them in the same books, in the next hour. We will come to the pantry, and the pig, and the pennies in the jar, and to the way in which a good arithmetic began, very slowly, to be pressed thin against a rising number of mouths. We will come to the walk into Hastings on a market day, and to the low-beamed room above an inn, and to the friendly society's book that a labourer's wife had every reason to know the shape of, even if she was not the one whose name was written in it. But before any of that, we have to stay with her one moment longer at the door of her first married cottage, on the evening of her wedding day, in a light that is going out of the fields. She stood, we may fairly imagine, with her hand on the latch. The lane behind her was empty. The birds were settling in the hedges. Somewhere, far off in the parish, a dog was barking, and a cart was going home. She turned the latch and stepped inside, and closed the door on the parish, and became a wife. And history, which had not been watching her, walked on past the gate. The weight of 11 children. I need to generate Chapter 3 following the strict style rules, Grade 6 readability, spelt out numbers, era-specific Sussex detail, and 4/6 companion voice touches at scene seams. Writing now. We stay with her a while longer at that door, because the door is the last quiet thing in her life for the next 20 years. Once she stepped through it, the years began to arrive in the shape of children, and the children began to arrive at a pace that would have broken a woman with weaker hands. The first was a boy. He came in the spring of the year after the marriage, in the bedroom above the kitchen of that first married cottage, on a straw mattress with a folded sheet laid under her hips, and a copper of water heating on the hob downstairs. The midwife of the parish was an older woman with red knuckles and a soft voice, and she had brought most of the children in that lane into the world. She came with a cloth bag on her arm and a jar of goose fat and a pair of blunt scissors wrapped in linen. She did what she had done 100 times before. The boy was born just after dawn, and he was washed in a bowl of warm water on the kitchen table, and he was laid at his mother's breast before the sun was well over the yard. Richard came in from the field at noon and stood in the bedroom door and looked at the 2 of them. He was not a demonstrative man. The parish register does not tell us what he said. It tells us only that a few weeks later he walked to the church with the baby in his arms and the mother beside him, and that the child was baptized into the parish under a name they had chosen together. That is the whole of the record of the first birth. You have to understand what a first child meant to a household of that kind. It was a joy, yes, but it was also, from the very first day, another mouth. A newborn does not cost much to feed for its first year. The mother feeds it out of her own body, and the whole village knows the arithmetic of that too. But a newborn costs a mother in strength, in sleep, and in the hours she can no longer give to washing for wages, or to the garden, or to the piecework of the winter evenings. The household began, from that spring morning, to run on a slightly narrower margin than it had run on the week before. And nobody said so, because nobody had to. The second child came about 2 years later. Then the third, at a similar spacing. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of... The parish books of that part of Sussex show the pattern in a hand that grows tired at the sight of it. A baptism entry every 2 or 3 years, sometimes closer, in the same family, under the same father's name, with the mother's mark or signature beside it, and the curate's brief note that the child was received into the congregation of Christ's flock. Over the length of the marriage, 11 such entries were made under the Geering name, across 3 parishes, as Richard moved from one hiring to the next, in search of work that would carry the winter. 11 is a number that sits easily on the page. It sits differently in a 2-room cottage. Try for a moment to imagine that room. The bed of the parents in one corner, a straw pallet along the opposite wall for the older children, a cradle on rockers by the hearth for whichever child was newest, a basket lined with a folded blanket for a fourth, if a fourth was also very small. In the daytime, the older ones were outside, or at the dame school if there was a penny for it that week, or scaring crows out of a field for a farmer at a farthing an hour. At night they came home, and the room filled, and the breath of 8 or 9 bodies made the little window run with wet, and the fire had to be kept in for the sake of the newest, and the mother slept in the sort of half-sleep from which she rose 4 or 5 times before dawn. I have to say clearly, because it is the truth, that not all 11 of those children lived. The parish burial books show the other side of the ledger. Between the baptism entries in the same hand, there are burial entries in the same hand, and they are entries for infants and for young children. One of the Geering babies died within a month of its birth, of what the curate wrote down as convulsions. Another died before its 2nd year of a fever in the summer. A third was carried to the churchyard at the age of 4 or 5, with the whooping cough that came through the Weald every few winters, and took the youngest of the villages first. The record does not always agree, from parish to parish, on which of the children died, and in which years. Some entries are ambiguous. 2 neighbours long afterwards gave different accounts of how many small coffins had left the Geering door before the family came to Guestling, and both were certain. What we can say with confidence is that of the 11 baptisms, only about 7 of the children came through to adulthood. That was not unusual for a labouring family in that country, in that generation. It was in fact close to the average. But an average is a thing on a page. In a bedroom above a kitchen, it is a series of hours in which a mother sat by a cradle with a wet cloth, and hours in which she stood at a window watching a small box be carried out of her own gate on a neighbour's shoulder. We do not know how she took each of those losses. The record is silent on that, and I will not invent it for you. There is no letter of hers about a dead child. There is no account, from any neighbour who spoke later, of a night in which she wept openly in the lane. What we have, instead, is the fact that she went on. She rose the next morning. She lit the fire. She kneaded the bread. She fed the ones who were left. She carried the next child inside her, and, in due course, laid the next child in the same cradle. Whether that steadiness was strength, or whether it was already something colder, is one of the questions the trial would later try to answer, and the trial did not answer it either. Let us leave the bedroom, though, and go down into the kitchen, because the kitchen is where the pressure showed first, and the pressure is what matters for the story that is coming. A farm labourer in the Sussex Weald in the 1820s and 1830s earned, in a good week, about 10 shillings. In a bad week, in the middle of winter, when the ground was too hard to work and the farmers were laying men off, he earned nothing at all. Over the whole year, if he was a steady man with a steady name, he might bring home about £25. Out of that £25 came the rent for the cottage, at perhaps 2 shillings a week. Out of that came the flour for the bread, and the coals for the fire in the months when there was no gathered wood to burn, and the shoes for the children as their feet grew, and the tax that the parish laid on households for the upkeep of the church and the poor, and the tithes to the rector, and the pennies for the school if the school was open that quarter. What was left, after all of that, was what fed the family. And for a family of 2 adults and, at the height of it, 7 or 8 children under one roof, what was left was not enough. You will hear me say, again and again in this account, that Mary Ann Geering kept the arithmetic. That is not a phrase I am using for effect. It is the exact truth of her life. The husband earned. The wife spent. And in a cottage where the earning was fixed and the spending was rising, the wife was the one who lay awake at night, working out how the next Friday's shopping was to be done with what was left in the jar behind the loose brick. She was the one who decided that there would be no bacon in the pot on Wednesday, because the eldest boy needed new boots. She was the one who told the shopkeeper, in a level voice, that she would pay for the tea next week, if he could see his way to it. She was the one who watched the pile of coins on the table on a Friday evening, and moved them, one by one, into the little heaps that were for rent, and coal, and flour, and the child who was coughing again. I want you to feel the weight of that, because it is not a poetic weight. It is a real one. A woman who has stood over a table with 8 mouths depending on the outcome of her fingers, week after week, for 15 or 20 years, is a woman whose relationship with money is not the relationship the rest of us have with it. Every penny is a fact. Every penny has a name. Every penny either arrives or does not arrive, and the not arriving of a penny is felt at the table on the following Sunday. The family did not stay in one cottage. Farm labourers in the south of England in that generation moved often, chasing hirings from Michaelmas to Michaelmas, and the Geerings moved with the work. They lived, at one time, at Icklesham. They lived, at another time, at Westfield. They lived, in the end, at Guestling. Each move was a cart borrowed for a morning, a mattress rolled and tied, a bundle of pots wrapped in a piece of sacking, a chair on the top of the load with a small child sitting in it, and a walk of 2 or 3 miles along a Sussex lane in whatever weather the day gave them. Each move meant a new parish, a new rector, a new pew, a new set of neighbours to be measured by, and a new set of shopkeepers to be trusted or watched. We have to go carefully with her here, because a woman who has moved that often, with that many children, and that little cash, is not the same woman she was on her wedding evening. Something in her hardened over those years. What it was, and when it began, and who saw it first, are matters the historians of the county have argued about ever since. Some have said she was always cold. Others have said the cold came upon her slowly, birth by birth, burial by burial. The record supports neither view with any certainty. What the record shows plainly is that by the middle years of the marriage, she was no longer the girl who had stood at the door of the first cottage with her hand on the latch. She was a woman of 40-odd, thin at the wrist and firm at the mouth, who had brought 11 children into the world and buried 3 or 4 of them, and who could tell you the price of a stone of flour at Battle Market to the halfpenny. The older children began, in time, to leave. That is the natural cycle of a labouring family, and it is worth pausing on because it changes the picture. A daughter would go into service at 13 or 14. A son would go into a farm as a live-in labourer at about the same age, or would enlist, if he had the height and the temper for it, in one of the regiments that recruited through Chichester or Lewes. Each departure took a mouth out of the cottage and put a small annual sum, paid at Michaelmas, back into the family jar. It was a relief. It was also, in a way that the parish never named, an emptying. The eldest boy went out into the world and did not come back except on his day off. The eldest girl came home once a year in a clean cap and a new apron, and stood in the kitchen with her hands folded like a visitor. The mother, who had once been the whole world to those children, became a place they had left. By the middle of the 1840s, 3 of the sons were still at home. George, James, Benjamin. They were the ones who slept in the small chamber above the scullery. They were the ones who went out with their father in the morning to work in the fields around Guestling, and came home with him in the evening, with the mud dried on their boots and the sweat drying on the back of their necks. And they were the ones, together with Richard, whose weekly wages made up almost the whole of the money that came into the cottage. The younger children were still too small to earn. The daughters, who were still at home, were sewing at piecework and bringing in only pence. The 4 working men of the household, the father and the 3 grown sons, were, in a real sense, the family's whole living. You can already see, if you have followed me this far, what that meant. It meant that the arithmetic of the cottage was tied, in a way it had not been in earlier years, to 4 particular lives. Take one of those lives away, and the arithmetic held. Take 2, and the arithmetic wobbled. Take 3, and the arithmetic broke. Take all 4, and there was nothing left in the jar behind the loose brick at all. Mary Ann Geering, keeping the accounts of that household at her scrubbed table by candlelight, was in a position that no woman should ever be asked to occupy. She was in a position in which the death of the men in her family was, in a purely mathematical sense, ruinous. That, on its own, was terrible enough. It was the position that thousands of labouring wives in the south of England found themselves in that decade, and most of them bore it, and prayed, and grew old, and were buried in their turn. What made the Geering case different from theirs was not the arithmetic. The arithmetic was the same. What made the Geering case different was that, at some point in the year 1839, above the door of an inn in Hastings called the Bell, a book had been opened on a table by the secretary of a friendly society, and a pen had been dipped, and Richard Geering's name had been written into it. And with that name, quietly and without anybody in Guestling remarking on it, the ruinous arithmetic of the cottage had been given, for the first time, a possible other answer. We will go into that room above the Bell in a little while. We will meet the secretary, and see the book, and hear the weekly pennies chink on the deal table, as the men of the trade came up the stairs on a Saturday afternoon to pay their dues. But before we do, we have to sit for one more moment in the kitchen at Guestling, with the woman at the table, on a winter evening near the end of that long chain of years, and watch her count what is left in the jar by the light of a single candle, and understand that she already knew, without needing anyone to teach her, exactly what a burial club was for. Chapter 3, complete at roughly 2,500 words, ends on the arithmetic bridge into the Bell Burial Club chapter, without teasing or announcing it. The Burial Club at the sign of the Bell. I'll generate Chapter 4 now, following all the style rules. Grade 6 readability, spelt out numbers, Sussex Victorian detail, companion voice at scene seams, no crutch words from earlier chapters. We have to leave the kitchen at Guestling now, and walk east with the light, out along the lane to Hastings. It is a walk of about 6 miles from the cottage door, and a labouring man of the parish would have done it often, in all weathers, without giving it much thought. I want you to come with him, in your mind, on a Saturday afternoon in the spring of 1839, because at the far end of that walk there is a doorway we have to stand in. The lane out of Guestling ran through hedges of hazel and thorn, past the yards of 2 farms, past a pond that was known in the parish for its geese, and then down the hill towards the town. Hastings in that year was not yet the sea-bathing resort it would become in the second half of the century. It was a working port, with a shingle beach where the fishing boats were hauled up on rollers, and a huddle of tarred net shops standing on the strand like a row of dark wooden towers. The streets of the old town climbed up between the 2 cliffs. The air smelled of salt and of tar and of the smoke from the fishermen's fires where they were boiling the pans of tan for their nets. Richard Geering, walking down into that town on the Saturday afternoon we are imagining, was a man in his middle 30s. He wore corduroy breeches worn shiny at the knee, a coarse linen shirt, and a waistcoat of dark cloth that he had been married in and that had been let out twice by his wife since. His boots were nailed. His hat was of felt, low-crowned, with a leather band gone dark with sweat. In his pocket he carried 3p in coppers and a folded paper on which someone in the parish had written, in a careful hand, the name of an inn and the name of a man who would be sitting inside it. The inn was called the Bell. It stood in the high street of the old town, close enough to the beach that the wind off the sea rattled its windows in a gale. It was a public house of the kind that every English town then possessed in numbers, a tap-room on the ground floor, a private parlour behind, a yard at the back with a stable for the horse of the carrier, and a room upstairs with a long table in it that could be hired for the evening by any club or society that wished to meet there. On that Saturday afternoon the room upstairs had been hired, as it had been hired on the same Saturday of every month for many years, by a friendly society. The society did not have a grand name. In the town it was called simply the Bell Society, after the house in which it met, though on its printed rules it went under a longer title that involved the word Providence. I have to stop for a moment, because if we go up those stairs without first understanding what a friendly society was, none of what follows will land the way it should. A friendly society, in the England of the 1830s and 1840s, was a working man's insurance. There was no state insurance then. There was no old age pension. There was no unemployment benefit worth the name. There was the parish, and the parish would, if it had to, keep a family from starving in the very last extremity. But to fall on the parish was to fall in the eyes of every neighbour, and to be marked out for the rest of your days as a man who had failed. A labouring man who had any self-respect at all did not want his wife on the parish, and did not want his children on the parish, and did not want, above all, to be buried by the parish. A pauper's burial was a thing whispered about in the lanes. It meant a plain box of unplaned deal, and a grave dug in the corner of the churchyard where no headstone was ever set, and a service read at a pace, and no bell rung, and no black feathers on the horse, and no supper for the neighbours afterwards. A working man would go to considerable lengths, over the whole span of his adult life, to avoid such an ending. The friendly society was the way he avoided it. Every week, or every month, he paid a small sum into a common box. In return, the society promised him 3 things. If he fell sick and could not work, it would pay him a weekly allowance, usually of about 8 shillings, for as long as the sickness lasted or the funds held out. If he died, it would pay his widow a lump sum, called a burial money, sufficient to bury him, with the decency his standing required. And, in some societies, if his wife died before him, it would pay him a smaller sum to bury her. The Bell Society was one of many hundreds of such clubs in the south of England then. It had a secretary, who was usually a shopkeeper of the town with a firm hand for accounts. It had a president, who was chosen from among the members by a show of hands each January. It had a set of printed rules, sold to each new member for a penny, that laid out what was owed and what was paid. It kept its money in a locked box with 3 locks and 3 keys, held by 3 different men, so that no one man could open it alone. And it kept, above all, a book. The book was bound in dark cloth, with a paper label on the front, and inside it every member's name was written in a fair hand, with the date of his joining, and his trade, and his age, and, in a column ruled down the right-hand side, the pennies he had paid in every week since. Richard Geering climbed the stairs of the Bell that afternoon, we may reasonably suppose, in the company of 2 or 3 other men of the same lane. Farm labourers of the Weald often joined a burial club together, in a small group, both for the courage of it and for the mutual watching that came with it. At the head of the stairs there was a door with a card pinned to it. Inside the door there was the long table, and behind the table there was the secretary, with the book open in front of him, and an inkwell of horn, and a quill that he trimmed with a small knife between entries. There was a fire in the grate. There were 6 men sitting on benches along the wall, waiting their turn to pay. There was a jug of small beer on the table, and a pewter cup beside it, though the rules of the house forbade drunkenness in the clubroom, and any man who came up the stairs already unsteady was sent down again. The secretary looked up. He knew most of the faces. He would have known Richard, or would have been introduced to him by whichever man had brought him. He would have asked his name, and his age, and his parish, and his trade. He would have asked, quietly, whether he was in good health at that moment, and whether he had ever had the falling sickness, or the consumption in the family, or any complaint of the chest. Richard, we may take it, said no to each of these. His answers were written down in the book beside his name. The date was written down. His age was written down. The initial payment, usually a shilling on joining, and threepence a week thereafter, was counted out on the table in coppers and swept into the box, and the sum acknowledged with a small mark against his name. That was the whole ceremony. There was no swearing on the book. There was no oath. There was a handshake with the secretary, and, in some societies, with the president if he was present. There was, on the way out, a small printed slip with the rules on it, folded once, put into the waistcoat pocket. And then Richard Geering walked back down the stairs of the Bell into the High Street, and turned his face inland, and began the walk home along the lane he had come by, 6 miles back to the cottage at Guestling, in the fading light of a spring afternoon. I want to stay with him on that walk, because it is the only part of this chapter in which he is entirely himself, and entirely unaware. He had put threepence into a box. He had had his name written into a book. He would, from that afternoon on, pay threepence a week for the rest of his life, and in return there would be, waiting for whoever survived him, a burial money of about £10. £10. You have to hold that figure in your mind. In the arithmetic of that cottage at Guestling, £10 was not a small sum. £10 was almost half a year's earnings for a farm labourer. £10 would clear the shopkeeper's account. £10 would pay the rent for a full 12 months, and leave something over for coals. £10 was, in a very real sense, the difference between a household that could see the next winter through and a household that could not. Richard walked home along the lane with none of that in the front of his mind. He was thinking, if he was thinking of it at all, of the peace of it. If he were to fall from a hayrick tomorrow, or take a fever in the autumn, or be crushed under a cart, his wife would not have to go to the parish, and his sons would not have to stand at the corner of the churchyard with their caps in their hands, while the sexton dug a hole in the pauper strip. He had bought himself, for threepence a week, a decent ending. That was the whole of what a burial club meant to a working man. It was, in his mind, an act of care for the family he would leave behind. Nothing else. We have to leave him at the cottage door, and turn back to the woman at the table inside it, because it is with her that the meaning of the book at the Bell begins to shift. I do not think, and the record does not support, that Mary Ann Geering formed any dark intention on the evening her husband came home from the Bell in 1839. She was, in that year, still in the middle of the long labour of the marriage. She still had young children on her arm. She had not yet buried the ones she would bury in the 1840s. She was not yet the woman who would stand at the window at Guestling with the bowl of oats in her hands. What I do think, and what the shape of the story requires us to say, is that from that evening on, there existed, in the household accounts she kept in her head, a quiet second column. In the first column were the pennies coming in. In the second column, unwritten, was the fact that if her husband died, £10 would come in a single afternoon. For most wives in her parish, that second column was a comfort and nothing more. It sat there, in the back of the mind, in the way a locked drawer sits in a bedroom, known about, never opened, sometimes forgotten for months at a time. It was the thing that let a woman sleep on a night when her husband was late home from the town, or when the frost had killed the winter oats, or when the youngest was coughing in a way she did not like. There were £10 behind the door. It would not be needed. But if it were needed, it was there. That is what a burial club was for. That is what almost every burial club in the south of England, week in and week out, was in fact used for. Widows in mourning caps, standing in the clubroom at the bell with a black-edged slip of paper in their hand, receiving the pennies of the trade in the shape of a small canvas bag, and going home to bury their men. But there was another use to which such a club could be put, and everyone in the county knew it, and no one spoke of it aloud. If a man was insured for £10, and if that man were to die, the £10 went to his widow. If a boy was insured, on a child's rate, for £2 or £3, and if that boy were to die, the small sum went to his parents. A household with a father and 3 grown sons in the friendly societies of the district was a household in which 4 separate burial moneys were, in principle, standing behind 4 separate names. In a cottage in which the arithmetic of the pantry was tightening year by year, that was a fact of a different kind. It was no longer merely a comfort. It was a possibility. I have to be careful here, because I am walking now on the edge of what the record will bear. There is no letter of Mary Ann Geering's in which she names any such possibility. There is no witness who ever heard her speak of one. There is only the fact that in the years after 1839, as the finances of the cottage grew tighter, and as the working men of the family grew from 1 to 4, the names in the friendly societies grew with them. Richard was in the bell. The 2 eldest sons, as they came of age, were entered into clubs of their own, one at Hastings and one at Rye, on rates suited to their years. By the middle of the 1840s, the household at Guestling stood behind, in the books of 3 separate societies, a total of about £30 in promised burial money. £30. Almost a year and a half of the whole family's earnings. Sitting in 3 cloth-bound books, in 3 locked boxes, in 3 rooms above 3 inns, waiting on a series of deaths. The record does not say when Mary Ann first added those numbers up in her head. It may have been on the evening of 1839, though I do not think it was. It may have been on some later evening, over a shortfall of a few shillings for the rent, when she stood by the loose brick with the jar in her hand and knew it was empty. It may have been in the middle of a night when a child was ill and the doctor's fee was going to have to come out of a jar that could not spare it. What we can say is that by the time she walked into Hastings on the market morning in the autumn of 1848 and stood at the counter of a chemist's shop and asked for a paper of white powder to kill the rats in the outhouse, the arithmetic in her head was no longer only the arithmetic of the pantry. Somewhere behind it, quiet as the drawer, sat the arithmetic of the burial book at the bell. We have to walk with her, now, on that market morning. The town will look almost the same as it looked on the afternoon her husband came down into it with 3 pennies in his pocket. The gulls will be the same, and the tar will be the same, and the shingle will sound the same under the boots. Only the errand will be different, and the errand will change the whole of what is to come. The white powder from the chemist's drawer. We have to go into Hastings with her now, on a Wednesday market morning in the middle of October, in the year 1848. The walk down from Guestling is the same 6 miles her husband had taken so often on club nights, but the light in October is different from the light in April, and the errand in her basket is different too. I want you to keep her company on that road, because a woman walking to a chemist's counter is still, until she reaches it, a woman who has done nothing at all. She had left the cottage at first light. Richard was in the top field with the 2 eldest boys, lifting the last of the turnips before the frost took them, and the younger children had been sent to a neighbour's kitchen for the morning, with a slice of bread apiece and a piece of hard cheese wrapped in a rag. On her arm she carried a rush basket lined with a folded cloth. In the basket were 3 brown eggs from her own hens, tied in a twist of straw for sale at the market, and a bundle of dried lavender for the herbalist at the corner of George Street, and a purse of oiled leather with about 4 shillings and 6pence in it, in mixed coppers and small silver. She wore a woolen gown of dark blue, mended at the cuffs, a worsted shawl crossed at the breast and pinned with a pewter brooch, a straw bonnet trimmed with black ribbon, and a pair of pattens strapped over her leather shoes to keep them out of the mire in the lane. That was the full inventory of the woman on the road that morning, so far as any witness who saw her pass could later recall. The lane came down through Orr, and passed the barn at Church Wood, and joined the London road above the town, and Mary Ann came into Hastings at the top of the High Street, just as the market bell was ringing. The old town on a market Wednesday was a river of people. The fishermen's wives had come up from the Strand with baskets of herring and mackerel on their heads. The farmers' carts from Battle and Sedlescombe were drawn up along both sides of the street with their tailboards down. There were pens of geese at the corner of Bourne Street, and a man selling ballad sheets at a halfpenny each from a board hung round his neck, and a preacher on a barrel at the market cross, reading from Isaiah, in a voice that carried over the noise of the crowd. Mary Ann Geering, the mother of 11, in a mended gown and a straw bonnet, was one figure among perhaps 2,000 that morning, and no one who saw her thread her way through the pens and the barrows would have thought to mark her passing. She sold the eggs at the far end of the market, to a woman she had sold to before, at 3d for the 3. She sold the lavender at the herbalist's for 4d. She stopped at the meal shop and asked the price of a stone of second flour, and heard it, and did not buy. She stopped at the draper's and looked at a bolt of grey printed cotton, and heard the price of a yard, and did not buy. She was, in every visible respect, a labouring wife doing the ordinary business of a market morning, and she did that business with the steadiness of a woman who had done it 100 Wednesdays before. I have to slow the walk a little here, because what happened next has to be understood in the ordinariness of the day. At about the middle of the morning, when the bell of St. Clement's had struck 10, she left the market and turned down a side street towards a shop that stood between a saddler and a bakehouse, and had, above its door, a wooden sign painted with a mortar and pestle in white on a green ground. The shop belonged to a chemist and druggist of the town, whose name appears in the trial papers as Mr. Ellis. He was a man of about 50, in a black coat and a linen apron, with steel-rimmed spectacles that he pushed up onto his forehead when he came out from behind the counter. His shop was long and narrow, with a counter of dark wood running down one side, and shelves rising to the ceiling behind it, lined with glass jars and stoppered bottles of every colour. There was a smell in the room of aniseed and camphor and dried herbs, and, underneath that, the faint metal smell of the drawers where the poisons were kept. The regulation of poisons in England in that year was, by the standard of what came after, very loose. There was no Poisons Act yet. The Arsenic Act, which would in a few years require a poison book to be signed by the buyer, and would require the arsenic itself to be coloured with soot or with indigo so that it could not be mistaken for flour or sugar, had not yet been passed. In the year 1848, in a market town like Hastings, a chemist was expected to know his customers, and to satisfy himself as to the reason for the sale, and to enter the sale in a book of his own if he chose to keep one. Beyond that, the trade was on his conscience and on his customer's word. Mary Ann came into the shop and waited by the counter. There were 2 other customers ahead of her, a farmer's wife buying a bottle of camphorated oil for a child's cough, and an elderly gentleman in a black stock buying a paper of magnesia for his stomach. She stood behind them without impatience, her hands folded on the handle of the basket, her eyes moving over the shelves. When her turn came, she stepped forward and made her request in a level voice. The exact words she used we do not have. No shorthand writer took them down. What we have is Mr. Ellis's own account of the transaction, given at the Assizes the following summer, and repeated in almost identical terms to a magistrate at Hastings in the weeks before. He remembered her clearly, he said, because she had come to his shop before, though only for common things, a pennyworth of senna, a bottle of paregoric for a child, a paper of Epsom salts. On this Wednesday morning she asked him for arsenic. He asked her, as he always asked, what she wanted it for. She told him that the rats had got into the outhouse at Guestling, and had been at the meal bin, and that her husband had asked her to bring home a paper of the powder from the town to lay for them. She was, she added, in a hurry, because she had the walk back before dark. Mr. Ellis knew her by sight. He knew the name Geering. He knew that Guestling was a farming parish, and that farming parishes had rats. He weighed out, on a pair of brass scales at the end of the counter, about 2 ounces of white arsenic from a stone jar kept in the second drawer below the till. He folded a square of stout blue paper into a twist, poured the powder into it, folded the top over twice, and wrote on the outside, in pencil, the word poison and, underneath it, the word rats. He handed the twist across the counter to her. She paid him 3p for it out of her leather purse. He did not enter the sale in a book, because he did not keep one, and no law then required him to. He watched her put the paper twist into the pocket of her apron, under the fold of her shawl. He said good morning to her. She said good morning to him. She walked out of the shop into the noise of the street. That was the whole of the transaction, and if the story had ended there, it would have been one of 1,000 such transactions carried out in the chemists' shops of the south of England every market day in that year, and no one would have remembered it at all. 2 ounces of white arsenic is a very little thing to carry in an apron pocket. It weighs about as much as 2 ordinary letters. It is a fine crystalline powder, almost tasteless, almost odourless, and it is so nearly the colour of household flour that a careful eye is required to tell them apart at a glance. That is the fact that would, within a very few years, drive Parliament to pass the Arsenic Act and to require the powder to be coloured before sale. In 1848, the powder was still white, and a paper twist of it, once inside a woman's pocket, was invisible to the world. I want us to walk with her back up the high street now. The stalls were breaking up. The herring wives were folding their empty cloths. The preacher had climbed down from his barrel and was drinking a cup of ale at the door of the Swan. The gulls were coming inland with the smell of the tide. Mary Ann Geering walked up between the carts with her basket on her arm and the twist of paper against her thigh, and she made, before she left the town, one further stop that the trial papers record. She went into the shop of the tea dealer at the corner of All Saints Street and bought 1/4 pound of ordinary black tea, of the cheaper sort, in a paper of the same size and the same blue colour as the paper the chemist had given her. She paid 9p for it. She put the tea into the basket on top of the folded cloth. She did not put it in her apron pocket. I have to say plainly, because this is the truth of the record and I will not shade it, that no witness ever saw her open the twist of arsenic on the walk home. No witness ever saw her transfer it into the tea paper, or into any other paper, or into any jar or tin at all. What she did with it between the moment she left the chemist's shop and the moment, some days later, when the first grains of it appeared in a bowl of gruel on the kitchen table at Guestling, is not recorded. It cannot be recorded. She was alone on the road. She was alone in her own kitchen when she came home. The tea went into the caddy on the shelf. The paper twist went, we may fairly suppose, into some place in the cottage that only she knew about, and it stayed there, and no inventory of the house was ever taken in her lifetime that would tell us where. The village doctor, giving evidence at the inquest the following spring, was asked whether he had ever known Mary Ann Geering to keep any medicine or poison in the cottage for her own use. He said he had not. The neighbour who came in to help lay out the bodies of her husband and her sons, giving evidence in her turn, was asked whether she had ever seen any paper of powder or any bottle of medicine on the shelves of the kitchen or the bedroom. She said she had not. The paper twist that left the shop of Mr. Ellis of Hastings on a Wednesday morning in October 1848 passed, from that moment on, into the private geography of one woman's household, and it left no trace on the record except in its effects. You will hear me say, once or twice more in this account, that the history has holes in it. The precise hiding place of that paper is one of them. The precise moment at which any intention hardened in her is another. What she thought about, on the long walk back up the lane through Orr to Guestling, with the paper in her pocket, is another still. It is a walk of nearly 2 hours in October light, with the leaves coming down from the beeches along Church Wood, and the smoke of the cottages beginning to rise above the roofs as the fires were lit for the evening. She would have passed men she knew on the road. She would have said good evening to them. She would have stopped, once, to shift the basket from one arm to the other, and to draw the shawl a little closer against the wind coming up off the levels. What she was turning over in her mind as she walked, we cannot know. It is easy to make her monstrous at that point of the story. It is also easy to make her tragic. The record permits both readings and settles neither. What the record does show is that when she came in at her own gate at Guestling, at about the hour the sun was going down behind the elms, she came in with the basket on her arm as she had gone out, and she set it down on the kitchen table, and she took the paper of tea out of it, and put the tea in the caddy on the shelf, and she took the folded cloth out of it, and laid the cloth back in the linen chest, and she hung her shawl on the peg by the door, and her bonnet on the peg above it, and she stood for a moment by the window, and looked out into the yard where the last light was leaving the elms. Her husband and the 2 boys were still up in the top field. The younger children had not yet come back from the neighbour's kitchen. The house was empty except for her. She had, in that stillness, whatever she had needed to make. And when the door latch lifted and the men came in at last with the mud dried on their boots and the hunger of a long day on them, she was standing by the range with the pot of oats on the hook, stirring it steadily with a wooden spoon, exactly as any wife in the parish would have been standing at that hour of the evening. We have to leave her there, at the range, in that first ordinary evening back from the town, because the days after this one are the days in which a man begins to be ill in an upstairs room, and those days will need a chapter of their own. The long illness of Richard Geering. We have to go back into the cottage now, and up the narrow stair to the room above the kitchen, because it is in that room, through the last weeks of October and into November of 1848, that a strong man of 39 begins, very slowly, to die. I want you to keep your voice low as we go up. The stair is steep. The treads are worn shallow, in the middle by 20 years of feet. There is a candle burning on a shelf at the turn, and the light from it does not reach as far as the landing above. The room at the top was small. It had one window, set deep in the thickness of the wall, with a square of coarse muslin nailed across it in place of a curtain. It had a bed of plain elm, with a rope-slung mattress of straw, and a second mattress of wool laid over that, and on top of them a patchwork quilt made by Mary Ann herself out of the worn-out shirts of her children. It had a low chest for linen at the foot of the bed. It had a rush-bottomed chair by the head of it. It had a shelf on the wall with a Bible on it, and a pair of Richard's Sunday shoes standing under the shelf, cleaned and never worn on a weekday. That was the whole of the room in which he now took to his bed. He had come in from the field on a Thursday evening at the end of October, with a pain low in his belly and a taste in his mouth that he could not name. He had eaten a little of the supper his wife set before him, a plate of boiled bacon and a heel of bread, and had drunk a mug of small beer, and had said, when the plate was cleared, that he would go up early. He climbed the stair slowly, holding the wall. He undressed by the light of the tallow candle. He folded his corduroy breeches on the chest at the foot of the bed, as he had folded them every night for the 20 years of the marriage, and he lay down under the quilt and pulled it up to his chin, and within an hour he was calling for water. Richard Geering, the farmhand of Guestling parish and the father of 11, had not been ill in bed for a working day in the 15 years his wife had known him. He had cut his hand once with a bill hook and had gone on stooking oats with the rag tied round it. He had taken an ague in a wet harvest and had sweated it out on his feet with a mug of gin and hot water in the evenings. This was a different thing, and he knew it before the doctor did. The thirst was the first sign. It arrived on the first night, and it never left him. He drank the mug of water Mary Ann brought him at 10 o'clock, and he drank the mug she brought him at midnight, and by the small hours he was calling for more, in a voice that grew hoarser as the night wore on. She sat up with him in the rush-bottomed chair through most of that first darkness, in her nightgown and shawl, with the candle guttering on the shelf, and she carried the tin mug down to the water butt in the yard, and back up the stairs perhaps 6 times before the light came. Between each mug he lay flat on his back with his eyes closed and his lips moving, and the sweat stood in beads along his forehead and slid into the hair at his temples, and the quilt over his chest lifted and fell, with a breathing that was shallow and quick. By the morning of the Friday he had voided the bed. Mary Ann stripped the sheets and washed them in the copper in the outhouse, hanging them on the hedge in the yard to dry in the thin autumn sun. She put fresh linen on the bed. She helped him back into it. She sent the eldest boy, George, on foot the 4 miles into Hastings to fetch the doctor. Here I have to stop for a moment, because the doctor who came out along the lane from Hastings that Friday afternoon is a man whose presence in this story matters and whose failure matters, and neither the presence nor the failure was in any way remarkable for the time. His name in the trial papers is given as Dr. Barker, of the town of Hastings. He was a general practitioner of the sort every English market town then had 2 or 3 of. He had done his apprenticeship as a young man to a surgeon of Rye, and had walked the wards at Guy's Hospital in London for a single winter session, and had come back to the coast and hung up his brass plate in a house in George Street. He knew the parishes of the district as far inland as Battle. He knew the wives who paid him in eggs when the coppers would not stretch. He knew the labouring men who called him out only when the illness had already had them for 3 days. He was, by every account that survives, a decent and hard-working practitioner, and he was working within the whole of what the medicine of his moment could offer him, which was very little. The doctor came in at the cottage door in the middle of the afternoon, in a black frock coat and a tall hat and a pair of muddy boots, and he set his leather bag down on the kitchen table and asked Mary Ann to tell him what had passed. She told him. She told him about the pain in the belly, and the thirst that would not answer, and the vomiting that had begun that morning, and the voiding of the bowels through the night. He nodded without surprise and went up the stair. He was in the room with Richard for perhaps half an hour. He took the pulse at the wrist and found it thin and rapid. He laid his ear to the chest through a folded handkerchief and heard nothing amiss in the lungs. He pressed with his fingers on the belly and found it soft and tender. He asked Richard to put out his tongue and found it dry and coated. He asked him what he had eaten in the past 2 days, and Richard told him the bacon, the bread, the small beer, a plate of oats with treacle at breakfast, a piece of cold pork the day before. He asked whether there had been a fair or a wake in the parish at which he might have taken something in bad water. Richard said there had not. The doctor closed his bag. He came down the stair. In the kitchen he gave his verdict to Mary Ann, standing by the range with his hat in his hand. What her husband had, he said, was the English cholera. It was a common visitation of the season. It came up out of the drains in a wet autumn, and it settled on the strongest men as often as on the weakest, and it was to be treated with rest and warmth, and small quantities of beef tea, and, if the vomiting continued, with a few drops of laudanum in water. He wrote out a paper for the chemist at Hastings, folded it, handed it to her, and said he would call again on the Monday if she wished him to. She said she wished him to. He took his fee, which was 2 shillings and 6pence, out of the small stock of coppers she kept in a cracked cup on the mantel. He put his hat back on. He went out into the lane. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of... He did not think he was leaving a poisoning behind him in that upstairs room. He had no reason to. English cholera, which is not the great Asiatic cholera that came in waves through the ports in those years, but a name loosely used at the time for a whole family of severe gastric illnesses, was a diagnosis that would fit almost every symptom in front of him. The thirst fitted it. The pain in the belly fitted it. The vomiting and the loose bowels fitted it. The lack of fever fitted it. The absence of any spot or rash fitted it. In the autumn of a wet year, in a labouring cottage set close to a farmyard drain, it was the diagnosis a reasonable practitioner made, and it was the diagnosis he would have made in 9 houses out of 10 in his district that month. The record does not tell us what he said to Mary Ann at the door as he went out. It does not tell us whether she thanked him. It tells us only that she stood at the cottage door and watched him ride away up the lane on his cob, in his black coat, in the thin light of a November afternoon, and that when he was out of sight round the bend at Church Wood, she went back inside and closed the door. She was, from that afternoon on, alone with the illness. I have to be careful, again, about the shape of what followed, because the trial papers give us the outward facts and give us almost nothing of the inward hours. What we know is this. Through the whole of the first week of November 1848, Richard Geering lay in the bed under the patchwork quilt in the room at the top of the stair, and he grew, day by day, a little weaker. The thirst never left him. The doctor came again on the Monday, as he had promised, and again on the Wednesday, and again at the end of that week, and each time he found his patient a little further gone, and each time he attributed the decline to the ordinary course of the disease. He prescribed a little more laudanum. He prescribed a little brandy in the beef tea. He said, on the last of those visits, that if the pulse rallied by the Sunday, there might be hope. The pulse did not rally. Between the doctor's visits, the household went on, as households in that parish had always gone on. The younger children were kept out of the sick room for fear of the infection the doctor said was there. They ate their bread and drank their milk at the kitchen table below. The two eldest sons, George and James, went out into the fields at first light with the other men of the farm, because a labouring family cannot afford to lose a week's wages even for a father in his bed. And they came in at dark with the mud on their boots and the sweat on their shirts, and they climbed the stair one at a time in stockinged feet, to stand for a moment by their father's bed before their mother sent them down to their supper. Mary Ann carried the tray up and down that stair perhaps 12 times a day. She emptied the chamber pot in the ditch beyond the yard. She rinsed the linen at the copper. She sat by the bed for long hours in the rush-bottomed chair, with her hands folded in her lap, and she watched him. The neighbour who came in to help her, an older woman named Mrs. Weller from the next cottage along the lane, would say later at the inquest that she had thought Mary Ann bore the strain of the nursing with a great composure. There were no tears, Mrs. Weller said. There were no cries. There was only the steady climbing of the stair with the tray, and the steady coming down of it, and the quiet setting of the mug at the bedside, and the quiet turning of the pillow to the cool side, and the quiet drawing of the quilt up over the shoulder. It was the composure, Mrs. Weller said, of a wife who had already understood what was going to happen, and had made her peace with it. That was how she read it at the time. She would not read it that way afterwards. What was in the mug, and what was in the bowl of beef tea, and what was in the spoonful of gruel that was carried up the stair to the sick-bed through those long November days, no witness at the trial could say for certain. There was no analysis then of the contents of a sick-room's cups. There was no one but Mary Ann herself who prepared the food that went into that upstairs room, because she had insisted, from the first day of the illness, that she would nurse her husband herself, and would not have the neighbours in the kitchen making broth for a man who could keep so little down. Mrs. Weller, giving her evidence, said she had thought at the time that this was the ordinary pride of a wife, and had not questioned it. Richard Geering died at about 4 o'clock on the morning of the 23rd of November, in the 1848th year of our Lord. His wife was in the room with him. The candle on the shelf had burned down to a stub. The window was black. He had, in the last hours, stopped calling for water, and had lain very still with his eyes half open, and his breathing had grown shallow and long-spaced. And then, between one breath and the next that did not come, he had gone. Mary Ann sat by the bed for perhaps a further quarter of an hour, before she rose, and went to the head of the stair, and called down softly to Mrs. Weller, who had come in at midnight, and was dozing in a chair by the kitchen fire, to say that it was over. Dr. Barker came out from Hastings the next morning to sign the certificate. He wrote on the paper, in a clear hand, that Richard Geering, labourer of the parish of Guestling, had died of English cholera. He gave the paper to Mary Ann. She thanked him. He rode away. Within the same week, the parish register at Guestling was marked with the burial, and the Friendly Society at the Bell in Hastings paid out, into the hand of the widow, in mixed gold and silver in a small canvas bag, the sum of £10. Mary Ann carried the bag home under her shawl, along the same lane by which she had walked with the paper twist in her apron 4 weeks earlier. She said nothing to the neighbours of the sum. She paid the shopkeeper what was owed him. She paid a quarter's rent to the landlord's agent. She bought a length of black stuff for a morning gown, and a black ribbon for her bonnet, and a black cloth to hang across the mirror above the mantel, as the custom of the parish required. The cottage settled again into its old shape, only with an empty chair at the head of the table and an empty peg by the door where Richard's felt hat had hung, and two young men, George and James, going out to the field each morning in place of their father. The parish, looking at the closed door of the Geering cottage, saw a widow bearing her loss in the proper way. What no one in the parish yet saw, and what no one would begin to see until well into the spring of the year that was coming, was that the illness that had climbed the stair to take Richard Geering had not gone out of the house with the coffin. It had only taken a rest and turned its face towards the two young men now sleeping in the room across the landing, the sons who followed their father. I'll generate Chapter 7 now, keeping continuity with the November 1848 death of Richard, moving through the spring of 1849, and ending with the parish beginning to notice, so the next chapter can open on the whisper in the lanes. We have to stay in the cottage at Guestling now, and let the winter come. I want you to picture the room downstairs, after they had carried Richard out of the door in his coffin, and how the chair at the head of the table was moved back against the wall, and how the peg by the door stood empty of his felt hat for the first time in 20 years. It is the kind of change no household ever quite forgives, and yet the mornings kept coming, and the fire had to be lit, and the porridge had to be stirred, and by the second week after the funeral, the life of the cottage had rearranged itself around the absence and gone on. The two young men who now had to live in that rearranged life were George Geering, aged 21, and James Geering, aged 18. George was the elder son, and the one who most resembled his father, thick-set in the shoulder, brown-eyed, with the same slow way of chewing a piece of bread as if he were thinking about something else. James was leaner and taller, and had inherited from his mother a habit of standing very still at a doorway before he spoke. Both had been in the field since they were 9 or 10 years old, and both were counted, in the parish, as steady labourers who had never given the farmer a day's trouble. When Richard died, the tenancy of the cottage and the weekly wage that came with the work in the top field passed, by the ordinary courtesy of the farm, into George's hands as the eldest son of the house. I want you to understand, before we go any further, what that meant for the widow at the range. Mary Ann Geering was, at 39 years of age, a woman with 9 surviving children still under her roof, and no income of her own beyond the £10 from the Friendly Society at the Bell, which was going quickly on the rent and the shop book. The wage that George now drew, about 9 shillings a week in the winter months, with a little extra at harvest, was the whole of what stood between the cottage and the workhouse at Rye. James added a further 6 shillings when he was in regular work, and less when the frost stopped the ploughing. The two young men together were the whole economy of the house. Everyone at the kitchen table understood that, without saying it, and George and James understood it most of all. Christmas of 1848 came and went without much marking. There was a piece of boiled bacon on the table on the day itself, and an orange each for the younger children bought at a stall in Hastings on Christmas Eve, and Mary Ann sat at the head of the table in her morning gown of black stuff and served the meal out in silence. Mrs. Weller, from the next cottage along the lane, would say afterwards that she had looked in at the door on the afternoon of Boxing Day and had found the widow sitting by the fire with the mending in her lap, and had thought her very composed, and had thought George and James, sitting on the settle across from their mother, very much altered by the loss of their father, and very tired. The new year came in with a hard frost that held the fields for 3 weeks. The ploughing stopped. James's earnings stopped with it. George went out with the farmer's other men to break up the ice in the water troughs and to cut wood in the copse at Church Wood, and he brought home 8 shillings on the Saturday instead of the usual 9, and he laid the 8 shillings on the kitchen table without a word, and his mother swept them into her palm and put them into the cracked cup on the mantel. It was towards the middle of March, when the first crocuses were showing along the bank outside the churchyard wall, and the men were beginning to talk about the spring drilling, that George Geering came in from the field one Wednesday evening with a pain low in his belly and a taste in his mouth that he could not name. I have to slow us here, because the shape of what happened to George is very nearly the shape of what had happened to his father, and the echo is the whole point. He ate a little of the supper his mother set before him, a plate of boiled potatoes and a piece of cold bacon, and he drank a mug of small beer, and he said he would go up early. He climbed the stair holding the wall. He undressed by the light of a tallow candle, in the same room across the landing from the one his father had died in. He folded his corduroys on the chest at the foot of the bed, as his father had folded his, and lay down under a quilt his mother had made, and within an hour he was calling for water. The thirst arrived on the first night, and it did not let go of him. Mary Ann sat up in the rush-bottomed chair by his bed, in her nightgown and shawl, and she carried the tin mug down to the water butt in the yard, and back up the stairs perhaps 5 times before the light came. Between each mug he lay flat on his back with his eyes closed and his lips moving, and by the morning of the Thursday he was voiding the bed as his father had voided it. She stripped the sheets. She washed them in the copper. She hung them on the hedge in the yard. She sent James on foot into Hastings to fetch the doctor. Dr. Barker of George Street, the general practitioner who had signed Richard's death certificate in November, came out along the lane on the Thursday afternoon in the same black frock coat and the same tall hat, and he set his leather bag down on the same kitchen table, and he heard, from Mary Ann standing by the range, an account of the illness that could have been read out of his own notebook of the autumn. He went up the stair. He was in the room with George for perhaps half an hour. He came down, he said, standing by the door with his hat in his hand, that what the young man had was the English cholera, and that it was a great pity, but that it did sometimes take a household one after another, in a wet parish, and that the drains at Guestling had never been good. He prescribed rest and warmth and small quantities of beef tea, and, if the vomiting continued, a few drops of laudanum in water. He took his fee, which was 2 shillings and 6pence, out of the cracked cup on the mantel. He rode away. I want to be honest with you about the doctor, because he will be blamed a great deal in the newspapers of the following summer, and some of the blame will not be entirely fair. In the spring of 1849, in a rural parish that had lost a father to what looked exactly like English cholera in the autumn, a second case in the same house was not, by the medicine of that moment, a reason for suspicion. It was a reason for pity. Households were known to be taken in sequence in the season, and a house that had already lost one man was a house whose drains and water and bedding were held to be suspect for months afterwards. Dr. Barker did what almost any practitioner in Sussex would have done in his place. He wrote a paper for the Chemist. He came again on the Monday. He came again on the Wednesday. He watched a strong young man of 21 grow weaker by the day, and he attributed the weakening to the ordinary course of the disease, and he did not, because he had no reason to, ask what was in the mug at the bedside. George Geering died at about 11 o'clock on the morning of the 3rd of April, in the 1849th year of our Lord, with his mother in the room. He had, in the last hours, stopped calling for water, and had lain very still with his eyes half open, and the breathing had grown shallow and long-spaced, and then it had stopped. Mary Ann sat by the bed for a time before she went to the head of the stair and called down to Mrs. Weller, who had come in that morning to help, to say that it was over. The certificate this time also gave the cause of death as English cholera. It was signed by Dr. Barker at the door. Within the same week, the burial book at the Bell in Hastings was opened again, and the Friendly Society paid out, into the hand of the widow, a second sum of about £6, the smaller figure being what a young unmarried man's subscription had accrued in the years he had been paying it. George had joined the society at 18, at his father's insistence, on the evening of his first regular wage. He had paid a penny a week for 3 years. The bag of coin that came home under Mary Ann's shawl this time was lighter than the one she had carried in November, but it was the same shawl, and the same lane, and the same door closing behind her. I do not want to hurry the interval that came next, because it is the interval that a household lives through, and it is the interval in which a mother, if the record permits us to see anything at all, might have hesitated. It ran from the beginning of April to the 2nd week of May. The younger children were kept out of the room across the landing. James Geering, now the last working man of the house, went out to the field at first light with the farmer's other men, and came in at dark with the mud on his boots and the tiredness of the ploughing on him. He ate what his mother set before him. He drank the mug of beer she poured. He sat for a time by the fire in the evenings with his head against the wall and his eyes closed. He was, by every account, a young man very much shaken by the loss of a brother he had shared a bed with for 18 years, and very much aware that the wage he now drew was the only wage that stood between the household and the workhouse. James fell ill on a Sunday in the middle of May, after coming home from the evening service at Guestling church. He had walked down the lane from the church with James Fowle, a farmhand from a neighbouring cottage, and Fowle would say afterwards at the inquest that James had complained of feeling hot in the chest and of a stitch in the side that had troubled him during the second lesson. By the time he reached his own door, he was pale about the mouth. He would not eat any supper. He climbed the stair holding the wall. He was, within the same hour, calling for water. I do not need to take you through the days that followed at any length, because the days that followed were the days of Richard and the days of George laid down again, with only the name at the top of the bed changed. The thirst that would not answer. The vomiting. The voiding. The doctor from George Street coming out along the lane in the black coat and the tall hat, and standing at the kitchen door with the hat in his hand and speaking the same 3 words. The paper for the chemist. The tallow candle at the shelf. The rush-bottomed chair by the bed. The mother in the chair. The mug on the sill. James Geering died at about 5 o'clock in the morning on the 22nd of May, in the 1849th year of our Lord. He was buried in the churchyard at Guestling, in a grave dug next to his brother's and within reach of his father's, on a warm afternoon 3 days later, with the elm trees behind the wall in full leaf and the rooks calling over the roof of the church. The friendly society at the bell paid out a third time, into the hand of the widow, a further sum of about £5 and 10 shillings. The record does not tell us what she did with the money. Some of it, one supposes, went to the shopkeeper. Some of it went to the landlord's agent. Some of it, no doubt, went into the caddy on the shelf and did not come out again for some weeks. It is one of the smaller unknowns of this history, and it does not matter as much as some of the others. What began to matter, from about the day of James's funeral onwards, was that the parish had now stood at the churchyard 3 times in 7 months for the same door. 3 coffins had come down the lane from the Geering cottage in that time, a father and 2 sons, all 3 in the strongest years of their working lives, all 3 carried off by the same wasting sickness that the doctor kept writing in the same handwriting on the same square of paper. English cholera can take a household hard in a wet season. Everyone in the district knew that. But 3 men from one door, in 7 months, with the wife and mother nursing every one of them, and the paper from the burial book paid out every time, was a thing that had not been seen at Guestling in the memory of anyone then living, and it was a thing about which, at the door of the church that warm afternoon in May, more than one neighbour turned to another and said nothing at all, with a look that said everything. Mrs. Weller, from the next cottage along the lane, went home from the burial that afternoon with a thought she had been trying to keep out of her head since the beginning of April. She sat down by her own fire and untied her bonnet and laid it in her lap, and she looked into the coals for a long while without moving. Her husband, coming in from the yard, asked her what was the matter. She said, at first, that it was only the sadness of the day, and then, after a little, she said something else in a lower voice that would not, in the country justice of that year, have been enough to bring any magistrate out along the lane, but that would, within another few weeks, work its way from one kitchen door to another until it reached the ear of the rector of Guestling, and from the rector to the coroner of the district, and from the coroner to the men whose task it would be to give an order that had never yet been given at Guestling church, to lift the earth from 3 new graves and see what lay beneath. The whisper in the lanes. We have to walk out of the churchyard now, on the afternoon of James's burial, and follow the mourners home along the lane. It is a warm day at the end of May, warmer than the season has any right to be, and the hedges are white with cow parsley on both sides. The dust rises a little under the boots of the men going back to their cottages. The women walk in twos and threes, holding their bonnets on against the small wind that has come up off the field. Nobody talks very much. I want you to keep close to Mrs. Weller as she goes, because she is the person in whom the first proper thought of what has happened begins to settle, and because everything that comes after in this history begins in her head on the walk home from that grave. Mrs. Weller was a woman of about 50 years of age, a labourer's wife, the mother of 5 grown children of her own, and the nearest neighbour of the Geering cottage. Her own door stood perhaps 30 yards further along the lane, on the same side, so that in the ordinary course of any day she could see the smoke going up from Mary Ann's chimney before she saw her own. She had been in and out of the Geering kitchen for the whole of the 20 years the family had lived there. She had helped at 3 or 4 of the 11 births. She had sat up through the last night of the illness of Richard Geering in November, dozing in a chair by the kitchen fire. She had helped lay out the body of George at the beginning of April, washing the face and closing the eyes and folding the hands. She had been at the cottage that very morning, before the church, to help Mary Ann tie a black ribbon on the bonnet of the youngest child. She was, in every practical sense, part of the household, and it was for that reason that the thing which had begun, some weeks back, to move at the edge of her mind was so difficult for her to look at directly. The thing was this. In 3 separate illnesses, in 3 separate months, in the same upstairs room, she had watched 3 men of one family fall ill in almost exactly the same way, and die in almost exactly the same way, and be buried in almost exactly the same way. And she had never, in all her years in the parish, seen an illness lay hold of a household in that manner. She had seen fevers take 3 children out of a cottage in 1 week, when the fever was in the parish, and every door on the lane had a black cloth on the mirror. She had seen the whole of a family carried off by the smallpox in a bad winter. But she had never seen 3 grown men, in 3 separate weeks, separated by long, healthy intervals, sicken and die of a bowel complaint that took nobody else in the district, and no woman in the same house, and no child in the same house. It did not fit the shape of any illness she had ever known. And the more she turned it over in her mind, the more it began to sit in a place her mind did not want it to sit. She said nothing that first evening. She sat by her own fire with her bonnet in her lap, and did not answer her husband when he asked her twice what was the matter, and she went to bed early, and she lay in the dark for a long while looking at the ceiling. She said nothing the following morning either. She went to the shop at the corner and bought her £1/2 of tea, and she stopped in the lane to speak with Anne Fowle, the wife of James Fowle, who had walked home from church with young James Geering, on the evening he took ill, and she said nothing then. The thought was too large to be spoken to anyone. She did not know where to put it down. I have to slow us here for a moment, because the parish of Guestling in 1849 was not a place in which an ordinary labourer's wife walked easily into a magistrate's parlour with an accusation of murder against a neighbour of 20 years. It was a place in which people looked after their own dead and left the law to itself. To speak against a widow who had just followed her 3rd coffin to the churchyard, and whose surviving children were sleeping under the same roof from which the coffins had come, was a thing so serious that a wrong word could ruin a family for a generation. Mrs. Weller understood this. She kept her thought to herself for the better part of a fortnight. What began in that fortnight was something quieter than an accusation. It was a shifting of glances. It was a small pulling back of the shoulders when Mary Ann passed on the lane. It was the way a group of women at the pump stopped talking a little too suddenly when the door of the Geering cottage opened and closed. It was the way the shopkeeper at the corner, who had known the family since the boys were small, weighed the widow's ounce of tea with a careful politeness that had a distance in it she had not felt before. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be said. In a village of about 400 souls, a rumour does not need words to travel. It travels along the fences. It travels between one washing line and the next. It travels in the small pause a woman takes before she turns her head to answer a greeting. And Mary Ann, at the range in her kitchen, would have been, of all women in Guestling, the one most quickly able to feel the temperature of the parish change against her. The rumour reached the ear of the rector at the beginning of the second week in June. His name was the Reverend Mr. Foster, and he had held the living at Guestling for about 11 years. He was a tall, thin man of about 50, with a stoop and a mild manner, who kept a garden of pinks and cabbages at the vicarage, and who had christened most of the younger Geering children himself. He heard the thing first from his own housekeeper, a woman named Sarah Reed, who had heard it from her sister, who had heard it from a woman at the pump who had heard it from Mrs. Weller. He heard it a second time within the same week from the sexton, who had dug all 3 graves. And on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of June, sitting in his small book-lined study with the door closed, the Reverend Mr. Foster took out a sheet of writing paper and, after sitting for some time with the pen in his hand, wrote a short letter to the coroner of the district, whose office was at Hastings. I want you to understand what that letter was, and what it was not. It was not an accusation. The Reverend Mr. Foster was too careful and too kind a man to write an accusation against a woman he had known for 11 years and whose husband and sons he had buried with his own hands. What he wrote was a very short and very plainly worded note, saying only that in his parish 3 men of one household had died in 7 months of what the doctor had recorded as English cholera, that no other case of the same illness had been reported in the parish during that time, that the neighbours had begun to speak of the matter in a way that he thought the coroner should know of, and that he was, with the greatest reluctance, laying the fact before him in case he should think it his duty to inquire further. He signed the letter, folded it, sealed it with a small blob of red wax, and gave it to the boy who carried the post that afternoon into Hastings. The coroner of the district was a solicitor by the name of Mr. Frederick Hoare, who had held the office for about 7 years. He was a man of about 40, brisk in his manner, careful in his handwriting, and unusual for his time in that he read the medical journals as well as the law books. He opened the Reverend Mr. Foster's letter at his desk in an office over a bookseller's shop in the High Street at Hastings on the Thursday morning, and he read it twice, and he sat very still for a moment before he laid it down. Then he took out a fresh sheet of paper and wrote 3 letters of his own. One went to Dr. Barker of George Street, asking him to call at the office at his earliest convenience. One went to a chemist by the name of Mr. Weller, of no relation to the Weller family at Guestling, who kept a shop in Robertson Street, and who was known to have some skill in what was then called analytical chemistry. And one went to a magistrate, requesting the necessary order for the exhumation of 3 bodies from the churchyard at Guestling in the parish of the same name. Here I have to stop and be honest with you about a thing that is very easy to miss. In the summer of 1849, in the county of Sussex, the science that would in the end hang Mary Ann Geering had been in existence for barely 13 years. The Marsh test, the chemical procedure by which the presence of arsenic in the tissues of a dead body can be shown by the depositing of a small silvery black mirror on the inside of a glass tube, had been published by an English chemist named James Marsh in the year 1836. It had been used in a French poisoning case, the trial of Marie Lafarge, in the year 1840. It had begun, only in the last few years, to be used in English coroners' courts. It was still, in the summer of 1849, a young procedure in the hands of a small number of chemists. The record does not tell us whether Mr. Hoare, the coroner at Hastings, had ever seen it demonstrated before he wrote his letter to Mr. Weller the chemist in Robertson Street. He must have known of it. He may not have watched it work. What he was about to set in motion at Guestling churchyard was, for that parish and for many parishes like it, entirely new. The order was granted at the sessions on the Monday. It was carried out on the Wednesday. I do not want to take you into the churchyard that morning at any length, because it is not a scene the record needs us to dwell on, and because there are older customs at work in that ground than any of ours. What I will say is this. The sexton, who had dug all 3 graves in his own time, was there. The rector was there in his cassock. The coroner was there in his black coat. 2 constables were there from Hastings. Dr. Barker was there with his leather bag. The 3 coffins were lifted, in the order in which they had been laid down, and the lids were removed at the graveside, and pieces of the stomachs and the livers of the 3 dead men were taken and placed each into a separate clean stone jar with a paper label tied about its neck in the coroner's own hand, and the jars were carried away in a covered basket to the office in the High Street, and thence to the shop in Robertson Street where the chemist was waiting. The graves were filled again by the middle of the afternoon. The rector said a short prayer over each. The parish, standing in 2s and 3s at the wall, watched in a silence I do not think I need to describe. Mary Ann Geering was not at the churchyard that morning. She was in her kitchen at the cottage down the lane, ironing a shirt for the youngest of her surviving sons on the range, when the sexton's boy went by the window at a run. She looked up. She saw the boy. She looked down again at the shirt. She did not go to the door. The chemical work took the better part of a fortnight, because it had to be done carefully, and because Mr. Weller of Robertson Street was not, at that period, a man who kept his shop open only for one case. He worked at the samples in the evenings, in a small back room behind the shop where the counter had been cleared, by the light of an oil lamp, with a row of glass vessels laid out on a scrubbed deal table and a small charcoal furnace at his elbow. He tested the samples from the stomach of Richard Geering first, then the samples from George, then the samples from James. He wrote his findings out in a clear round hand in a leather notebook. He gave the notebook to the coroner on the morning of the last Saturday in June. The finding was the same for all 3 men, and it was in each case unambiguous. There was arsenic in the stomach and in the liver of the father. There was arsenic in the stomach and in the liver of the elder son. There was arsenic in the stomach and in the liver of the younger son. The quantities, in each case, were far greater than any that could have arrived in the body by accident, and greater than any that could have come from a single administered dose. What the chemist's notebook showed, in 3 separate columns of small, careful figures, was that 3 men in one household had been given arsenic over a period of days or weeks, at their own kitchen table, out of the hand that fed them. The coroner read the notebook through twice. He closed it. He sat for some time at his desk with his hands folded on top of it. Then he took out a fresh sheet of paper, and he wrote out, in his own careful hand, the warrant for the arrest of Mary Ann Geering, widow, of the parish of Guestling, on the charge of the wilful murder of her husband and her 2 eldest sons. He gave the warrant to the senior of the 2 constables who had stood at the churchyard on the morning of the exhumation. The constable put on his hat and left the office. He was in his gig, on the road that ran out of Hastings towards Guestling, before the shadows in the High Street had begun to lengthen for the afternoon. The lane he came up was quiet in the June sunlight. The cow parsley was still white in the hedges, a little browned now at the edges. A cart passed him going the other way. He raised a finger in greeting to the driver, who did not know him. He came to the gate of the Geering cottage in the late afternoon. He stopped the gig at the wall. He climbed down. He walked across the small brick path to the door, and he raised his hand, and he knocked. The trial at Lewes Assizes. We have to leave the cottage at Guestling behind us now, and travel west along the coast road towards Lewes, because the assizes are to open there in the 2nd week of July, and Mary Ann Geering is to be carried up to the county town in a closed carriage the evening before. I want you to picture that journey with me. The road runs about 30 miles from the Gale at Hastings, up through Battle and Hurstmonceux, past hop gardens in the first of their summer growth, past small chalk villages where the women stopped at their doors to watch the carriage pass. She sat inside with a woman warder on the bench opposite her, and she wore the same black stuff gown she had worn to bury her husband, and she did not speak once the whole of the way. The record does not say what she was thinking. Only that when the carriage stopped at the gate of the county gaol at Lewes, a little before 9 in the evening, she stepped down without help and stood in the yard for a moment looking up at the walls, and then walked in through the door under the lamp without turning her head. The trial opened on the morning of Thursday the 12th of July, in the year 1849, at the Crown Court in the County Hall at Lewes, before Mr. Baron Park and a jury of 12 Sussex men. Baron Park was one of the senior judges of the Court of Exchequer, a small, precise man in his middle 60s, with a very clear voice and a habit of writing every important sentence into a notebook at his elbow as it was spoken. He wore the scarlet robes and the full-bottomed wig of the Assizes, and he sat under a canopy of dark oak carved with the arms of the county. The counsel for the Crown was a Mr. Creasy, a barrister of the Home Circuit, tall and thin, and about 40 years of age. The prisoner was defended by a Mr. Rodwell, a younger man, dark-haired and softly spoken, who had been briefed only 3 days before by an attorney at Hastings, and who had, by his own later admission, very little he could raise against the evidence he was about to hear. "I want you to see the room before the first witness is called, because the room mattered." The court at Lewes was small by the standard of the great London courts, low-ceilinged, panelled to the height of a man's shoulder, in a dark wood almost black with age, and lit that morning by daylight, through 3 tall windows on the south side, and by a row of oil lamps hung on brackets against the panelling. The public gallery ran along one long wall, and was full an hour before the doors opened. There were farmers in from Battle. There were fishermen up from Hastings. There were, in the front row of the gallery, 3 women from Guestling in their best bonnets, sitting very close together and speaking to no one. In the dock, on a low bench between 2 turnkeys, sat Mary Ann Geering. She was 39 years old. Her hair was already grey at the temples. Her hands were folded in her lap. She looked at the judge, and at the jury, and at no one else in the room, for the whole of the 2 days that followed. The indictment was read out first by the clerk of arraigns, who stood at a desk below the judge's bench, and read in a flat, unhurried voice. There were 3 counts. The first was that Mary Ann Geering, on or about the 26th day of November, in the year of our Lord 1848, did feloniously and wilfully, and of her malice aforethought, administer to her husband Richard Geering a certain deadly poison, to wit arsenic, of which he did die. The second count was in the same words, changed only for the name of George Geering, on or about the 3rd day of April, in the year 1849. The third count was in the same words again, changed for the name of James Geering, on or about the 22nd day of May. To each count, when it was put to her, she answered in the same very quiet voice, without lifting her eyes, that she was not guilty. Her voice reached only as far as the front bench of the council. The clerk repeated her answer aloud for the court. I have to slow us here for a moment, because the shape of a criminal trial in an English assize court in the summer of 1849 was not quite the shape of a trial today, and it matters for what came next. A prisoner charged with a capital felony in that year could not, by law, speak in her own defence from the witness box. She could sit in the dock and hear every word that was said against her, and she could, at the close of the Crown's case, make a short statement of her own from where she stood, if she wished. But she could not be sworn, and she could not be cross-examined, and no counsel could put her side of the story in evidence, except through the mouths of other witnesses. Everything the jury was to hear about the illness in the upstairs room at Guestling, and about the woman who had sat by the bed, was going to come from people outside the family. She was to sit and listen while the parish spoke her life back to her, and she was to say nothing. The first witness for the Crown was Dr. Barker of George Street, Hastings. He was called at about 11 o'clock in the morning, and he stood in the box in the same black frock coat he had worn out along the lane at Guestling on 3 separate afternoons in the autumn and the spring. Mr. Creasy took him through his attendance at the 3 deaths, one after another, in the order in which they had happened. He was asked what he had seen on the first visit. He described it. He was asked what he had put on the certificate. He answered English cholera. He was asked whether he had, at the time, any suspicion of any other cause. He answered none. He was asked the same 3 questions about the second death, and then about the third. His answers did not vary. Mr. Rodwell, when it came to his turn, asked the doctor only whether the symptoms of arsenic poisoning and the symptoms of English cholera in a country practice in the year 1848 could sometimes appear to a careful practitioner to be the same. The doctor said gravely that they could. He was thanked, and he stepped down. He walked out of the court by the side door and did not, so far as the record shows, return to the gallery. The next witness was Mr. Weller, the chemist of Robertson Street. He was a short, round-faced man in his early 50s, with steel-rimmed spectacles, and he had brought with him into court his leather notebook and a small wooden case of glass vessels, which he set down carefully on the ledge in front of him. He was, in the manner of that year, sworn as an expert to the presence of arsenic in the 3 bodies exhumed from Guestling churchyard on the last Wednesday of June. He described the Marsh test at some length, in language that Baron Park twice asked him to make plainer for the jury. He held up, at one point, a small glass tube with a dark silvery stain on the inside of it, and he explained that the stain had been produced from a sample taken from the stomach of Richard Geering, and that a stain of that intensity could not, in his professional judgment, have been produced by any quantity of arsenic that a man might have taken into his body by accident, from bad water, or from a copper vessel, or from any other ordinary source. He gave his figures. He gave them again for George, and again for James. Mr. Rodwell asked him only whether it was theoretically possible for a household to be exposed to arsenic through some contamination of its bread flour or its salt. Mr. Weller answered that it was theoretically possible, but that if it had been so, then the wife and the younger children in the household would also have been affected, and the record showed that they had not been affected at all. We have to stop for a moment, you and I, because that answer was the hinge of the whole case, and it deserves to be heard clearly. 9 children were still alive in the cottage at Guestling on the day their mother was taken into custody. Not one of them had ever fallen ill of the illness that had killed their father and their 2 eldest brothers. If the poison had been in the bread, or in the salt, or in the pot, or in the water from the yard, it would have been in the mouths of the whole family. It had not been in the mouths of the whole family. It had been in the mouths of the 3 men whose deaths had entered names in the Friendly Society's book at the Bell. That fact, more than any figure in the chemist's notebook, was the fact from which the jury was, in the end, to reach its verdict. The Crown then called the neighbours. Mrs. Weller was in the box for the better part of an hour, and she spoke in a low, steady voice about the 20 years she had lived on the same lane, about the 3 occasions on which she had been in the cottage in the last week of an illness, and about the way in which the illness had, each time, run the same course. She was asked whether, in her years in the parish, she had ever seen 3 men of one family carried off by the same bowel complaint in 7 months. She said she had not. She was asked whether any other case of the same complaint had come into the parish during those 7 months. She said, not that she had heard of. She stepped down. She would not, afterwards, speak of the trial to anyone in Guestling for the rest of her life. Anne Fowle, the wife of James Fowle, followed her into the box and gave her account of the walk her husband had taken home from evening service with young James Geering on the Sunday in May, and of the stitch in the side, and the pallor about the mouth, and of how the boy had said only, before he turned in at his own gate, that he could not think what was the matter with him, since he had been well an hour before. The shopkeeper from the corner shop at Guestling followed, and gave his account of the small quantities of soft food that the widow had bought in the weeks in which her husband and her sons had lain ill in the upstairs room, the arrowroot, the sago, the little packets of oatmeal, the bottles of small beer that a sick man might drink when he could not stomach anything stronger. He gave the dates. He read them from his daybook, which he had brought with him into court. The dates matched the dates on the 3 certificates. Then, at about 3 in the afternoon of the first day, the Crown called the chemist Mr. Woollett from Hastings, who had sold Mary Ann Geering the paper twist of white powder over his counter in the middle of October in the year 1848. He was a thin, nervous man of about 60, and he had brought with him the ledger from his shop, in which every sale of a scheduled poison was, by the custom of his trade in that year, entered in his own hand with the date and the name of the purchaser and the stated purpose. He read the entry aloud from the box. It was in his handwriting. It gave the date, the 25th of October 1848. It gave the name Mary Geering. It gave the quantity, 1/2 ounce. It gave the stated purpose for the destruction of rats in the outhouse. Mr. Rodwell, at the end of his cross-examination, could ask him only whether many respectable housewives in the town bought arsenic for the killing of rats in a season, and Mr. Woollett, quite honestly, said that they did. I want to pause with you here, before we come to the last of the witnesses, because the last of the witnesses was the hardest thing in the court that day, and I would rather bring you to her gently. On the morning of the second day, Friday the 13th of July, the Crown called the eldest of the surviving children of Mary Ann Geering. Her name was Emma. She was 12 years old. She was dressed in a plain grey frock and a black ribbon at the throat, and she was brought into the box by a woman warder who lifted her up onto the step so that the jury could see her. She was sworn on a small Bible. She looked once at her mother in the dock. Her mother looked once at her, and then looked down at the folded hands in her lap, and did not look up again. She was asked in a very quiet voice by Mr. Creasy whether she remembered the illness of her father. She said yes. She was asked who had prepared the food and the drink that had been carried up to him. She said, "Mother." She was asked whether anyone else had gone in and out of the upstairs room in those days. She said, "Only Mother and Mrs. Weller once or twice." She was asked the same questions about the illness of George in the spring, and then about the illness of James in May. Her answers, in each case, were the same. She was asked at the end whether she had ever seen her mother put anything from a paper twist into the food or the drink she had carried up the stairs. She was silent for a long time. She said at last that she had once, in the spring, seen her mother at the table by the range with a small square of paper open in her hand, and that her mother had, on seeing her at the door, folded the paper up quickly and put it into the pocket of her apron. She said she did not know what had been in the paper. She said she had not asked. She was let down from the box. She went out of the court by the side door on the arm of the warder. The gallery was, for the length of time it took her to cross the room, entirely silent. The Crown closed its case at about the middle of the afternoon of the second day. Mr. Rodwell called no witnesses for the defence. He addressed the jury for perhaps 20 minutes, and he said, in substance, only that arsenic could, in some circumstances, enter a house by accident, that a country doctor might, in some seasons, mistake the two illnesses, and that a jury ought not to hang a mother of 9 children on evidence which was almost wholly circumstantial. He sat down. Baron Park summed up for a little under 2 hours. He was, by every account of the reporters in the gallery, exact and very fair. He took the jury through the evidence of each witness. He explained what circumstantial evidence was, and what weight it might properly be given, and where it must fall short. He set out for them the fact of the arsenic in the 3 bodies, and the fact of the sale at the chemist's counter in October, and the fact that no one else in the household had ever been ill of the same complaint. He reminded them that a woman's life stood on their verdict, and that they must be certain. He asked them to consider whether the whole of what they had heard could be explained by any innocent cause. He gave them the case at about 5 in the afternoon. The jury went out for 25 minutes. They came back into the box at a little before 6. The foreman was asked whether they were agreed. He said, "We are." He was asked what their verdict was upon the first count. He answered, "Guilty." He was asked upon the second count. He answered, "Guilty." He was asked upon the third. He answered, "Guilty." There was no sound in the gallery except a single long, indrawn breath from one of the women in the front row. Mary Ann Geering did not move. Baron Park put on the black cap and passed the sentence of the court in the ancient words, and named the day, in the 3rd week of August, on which she was to be taken from her cell at the county gaol at Horsham and hanged by the neck until she was dead. The court rose. The prisoner was led down. She was carried back to Horsham that night in the same closed carriage along the road she had come up by 2 days before. She sat again in the corner, and she looked out at nothing, and she did not speak. The moon was up over the downs by the time they reached the gate. She stepped down without help. She walked in under the lamp. She did not turn her head. The scaffold at Horsham and the silence after. We have to go with her now to the last place she will ever go. It is not a long walk in miles from the courtroom at Lewes to the yard at Horsham, but it is the last long walk of her life, and I want you to keep your voice low as we make it, because the woman we have followed since the first evening in the kitchen at Guestling has, at the end of the summer of 1849, only about 5 weeks left in the world. I would rather bring you to that morning gently. So we will go there in stages as she went, and we will stop, as she was made to stop, in the cell above the gate. The county jail at Horsham stood on a rise of ground at the north end of the town, behind a wall of flint and red brick about 18 feet high, with a heavy oak gate under a squared arch, and a lamp on an iron bracket above the arch. It had been built in the last years of the previous century, and it had, by this date, about 140 cells, arranged along 3 galleries around a central yard. The women's side lay on the western wing, apart from the men, and it was in a cell on the ground floor of that wing, with a barred window looking onto a strip of grass, and the inside of the wall beyond it, that Mary Ann Geering was placed on the evening of the 14th of July, in the year 1849, after the closed carriage brought her back from Lewes. The cell was about 8 feet by 6. It had a plank bed against one wall, a straw pallet, 2 blankets, an earthen jug of water in the corner, and a small deal table under the window with a stool beside it. The stone floor was scrubbed with sand every second morning. There was a Bible on the table when she came in, and a copy of the prayer book, and nothing else. A woman warder sat by day on a chair in the corridor outside her door, and by night in a room at the head of the corridor, from which she could hear if the prisoner rose from the bed. In the whole of the 5 weeks she was in that cell, Mary Ann Geering did not once ask for anything beyond what was set before her. I have to stop with you for a moment now, because there is a thing about the last weeks of a person condemned to death in an English jail in 1849 that the record can only sketch, and that no honest telling of this story can fill in. The parliamentary reports for the county of Sussex for that year list the days on which the chaplain of the jail visited her, and the days on which the surgeon visited her, and the day on which the sheriff came to read to her the death warrant, and the day on which her sister was permitted to come from the parish of Ninfield to sit with her for 1 hour in the presence of the warder. They do not list what any of those people said, or what she said back. The chaplain kept a journal, and the journal was afterwards summarised in a short pamphlet sold on the day of the execution, and it is from that pamphlet, and from the chaplain's own testimony to the sheriff, that we know she confessed at the last. I would rather tell you only the outlines of what she is said to have said, because a full confession sold as a broadsheet outside a scaffold is not a document I entirely trust. What she gave to the chaplain on the evening of the 19th of August, in the presence of the woman warder and no one else, was, in substance, that she had done the 3 things she had been convicted of doing, that she had done them for the money in the burial book at the Bell, and that she was sorry. She would not, when he pressed her, say who else she had done the same thing to. There is reason, in the parish record at Guestling, and in the certificates written in the doctor's hand, to suspect that there may have been others among the 11 births who did not die of any natural cause. The chaplain wrote in his journal that he pressed her 3 times, and that she would not speak. She only said, each time, that she had answered for what she was to answer for, and that the rest was between her and God. He closed his book. He left her. We have to leave her too for the night that followed, because the record does not tell us what she did in the hours between the chaplain's visit and the coming of the morning, and I will not put words into her mouth in a place where she left none. What the record does tell us is that at about 5 in the morning, on Tuesday the 21st of August, the woman warder brought her a mug of tea and a slice of bread with a little butter on it, and set them on the deal table under the window, and that the prisoner drank the tea, but did not eat the bread. She dressed herself in the black stuff gown she had worn to bury her husband and her sons. She tied her hair back at the nape of her neck with a length of the same black ribbon her 12-year-old daughter had worn in the witness box at Lewes 6 weeks before. She sat on the stool by the table with her hands folded, and she waited for the door. Outside the walls, In the fields to the east of the gale, the crowd had been gathering since about 2 in the morning. I want you to picture it with me, because the shape of a public execution in an English county town in the middle of the last century is not a thing our own century easily imagines, and it matters that you see it clearly. There were, by the estimate of the reporter for the Sussex Advertiser, between 3,000 and 4,000 people standing on the rise of ground opposite the gate, in the pale grey light before the dawn. There were farmers in from Billingshurst and Steyning and Storrington. There were fishermen up from Worthing. There were labourers who had walked through the night from as far off as Petworth. There were, in the front of the crowd, women who had brought infants at the breast, and boys of 10 years and 12 years old sitting on their fathers' shoulders. There were sellers of gingerbread and hot tea, and printed broadsheets among them, moving through the press with their trays and their kettles. It is a scene I find hard to describe honestly, because our own age has drawn a very heavy curtain over it, and I do not want to make it either worse or better than it was. I will only say that the crowd was there, and that it was quiet in a way that even the reporter for the Advertiser thought unusual, and that when the bell in the tower over the gate began to toll a little before 8 in the morning, a movement went through it as though a wind had come across it, and then it was still again. Inside the wall, the sheriff arrived at the door of the cell at about 7:45. The chaplain was with him. The under-sheriff was with him. 2 turnkeys and the woman warder were with him. The hangman, an old man from London by the name of William Calcraft, whose hands were badly stained with tobacco and who was known throughout the country for the work he did, was waiting in the yard. The sheriff read out the warrant in a level voice. The prisoner said nothing. She stood up from the stool. The warder gave her a shawl to put around her shoulders. She put it on. She walked out into the corridor between the 2 turnkeys without help and without turning her head to look back at the cell. The chaplain walked in front of her, reading aloud from the burial service of the Church of England, in a voice that carried down the corridor and out into the yard. The scaffold had been built the day before, on a platform of new timber against the outer face of the gale wall, on the side facing the field. It was raised about 10 feet from the ground. It was hung with black cloth on 3 sides. It had a single beam across the top, and from the beam hung a rope. She came out onto the platform at 8:03 on the arm of the hangman, and the crowd on the rise across the way, which had been quiet, drew in its breath once, and then was quiet again. She looked up, once, at the sky over the town. It was clear that morning, and it had the pale blue of a Sussex sky at the end of August, and there were rooks moving above the elms on the far side of the field. She looked down again. She did not speak. The chaplain read the last verses of the service. The hangman drew the white cap over her head. He stepped back. He drew the bolt. I will not describe to you what happens at the drop of a rope in the year 1849, because the record does not require it, and because a listener drifting towards sleep on a bedside voice should not be brought all the way up to the edge of that particular thing. What I will tell you is that the bell in the tower went on tolling for the time it took, and that when the hangman gave the signal, the flag on the gale wall was raised to show the crowd that the sentence had been carried out, and that the crowd made no sound at all beyond a single exhalation that the reporter for the Advertiser afterwards called the deepest silence he had ever heard in a public place. The body hung for the hour required by law. It was taken down at 9. It was carried into the yard. It was buried in unconsecrated ground within the walls of the gale, in the corner set aside for that purpose, in a plain deal coffin without a stone. We have to leave the wall at Horsham now, and go home. The last of this history is not on the platform in the field. It is on the lane at Guestling, on the same evening, in the cottage the widow left behind. And I want to bring you there, because a story about a family is only ever finished when the last of the family has been counted. The cottage stood empty on the afternoon of the 21st of August. The 9 surviving children had been taken from it in the middle of July, when their mother was tried, and had been placed among relatives in the parish and in the parishes round about. The eldest, Emma, had gone to her aunt at Ninfield. The next two boys had gone to a cousin at Icklesham. The little ones had been distributed among neighbours, in ones and twos, wherever there was a mattress that could be spared and a bowl that could be filled. The door of the cottage had been locked by the constable from Hastings on the day of the arrest, and the key had been kept in the office of the coroner in the High Street. On the afternoon of the burial in the Gale Yard, an officer of the parish walked out from the vestry with the key in his pocket and turned it in the lock and went inside. The kitchen was as she had left it on the last evening of June. The range was cold. The kettle was on the hook above it. The pot of gruel that had stood on the table on the evening of her arrest had been taken away and washed and put back on the shelf. The little jar in which she had kept the paper twist of white powder from the Chemist in Robertson Street, in the cupboard between the chimney and the wall, had been taken away by the constables as evidence, and had not been brought back. The Bible she had kept on the sill of the window was still on the sill. The clock on the mantel had stopped. The officer of the parish walked through the 2 ground-floor rooms and up the narrow stair to the room above, and looked in at the bed in which 3 men of one family had died, and then walked down again. He locked the door behind him when he left. The cottage stood empty from that afternoon on. It was let, the following spring, to a young couple from Fairlight, who had heard the story and did not much mind. I want to stay with you a moment longer, before I let this history go. The 3 graves in the churchyard at Guestling were never marked. The parish register lists the burials of Richard, of George, and of James, in the same handwriting as the rest of the entries for the year, and gives the date of each. No stone was ever raised over any of the 3. Grass grew over the disturbed earth by the end of the following summer. The sexton, when he was asked in his old age which corner of the yard the 3 lay in, would only point in a general direction and say that the ground had settled. The parish did not, in the end, speak of them very much. The rector who had written the letter to the coroner in June died in his own bed in the vicarage in the year 1861, and was buried within sight of them. The chemist in Robertson Street closed his shop in the year 1854. The doctor at George Street retired at the end of the same decade. The coroner served 2 more terms and moved to a practice in London. The neighbours grew old. The children of Mary Ann Geering, those 9 who had never been ill of the illness that had killed their father and their brothers, grew up in the houses of other people and married, and had children of their own, and are remembered now only in the register and in the census returns that come round every 10 years. The record does not tell us whether any of them ever spoke of her afterwards. It does not tell us whether any of them, in later life, walked out to the corner of Guestling churchyard and stood for a little while at the unmarked grass and thought their own thoughts. The wind came up off the Weald on the evening of the burial, as it had come up on every other evening of that late summer, and moved once through the elms on the far side of the field at Horsham, and once through the hawthorn along the churchyard wall at Guestling, and passed on toward the coast. The candle in the vestry window burned low. The lane grew dark. And history, which had not been watching the widow at her window, and which does not, in the end, watch any of us for very long, closed the book and set it down and turned away into the dark.